Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into the cramped, lint-filled world of a 19th century New England mill town. One of those places where the American Industrial Revolution chewed up farm girls and spat out textiles. Picture yourself as a 17-year-old factory worker in 1840s Lowell, Massachusetts, waking to a bell that sounds like someone's murdering a church tower with a sledgehammer. You probably won't survive this with your hearing intact, and your lungs might develop some opinions about cotton dust that your doctor will politely ignore. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. I love seeing this community spread across the globe. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The bell. Always the bell. It's 4:45 in the morning, still pitch dark outside your boarding house window, and that relentless clanging pierces through your shallow sleep like a dentist's drill through a rotten molar. You're wedged into a narrow bed, one of two in this cramped attic room, sharing space and a thin mattress with another mill girl named Sarah who kicks in her sleep. On the other bed, 4 more girls are already stirring, groaning, cursing under their breath in ways that would scandalize their mothers back on the farm. The room is freezing. January in Massachusetts doesn't care about your comfort, and your boarding house keeper certainly doesn't waste money heating sleeping quarters. Your breath forms little clouds in the darkness as you fumble for the dress you draped over the bedpost last night. It's still damp with yesterday's sweat and the perpetual humidity of the weaving rooms, but there's no time to care. The bell means you have exactly 15 minutes before the mill gates close and latecomers get their pay docked. A quarter day's wages gone just like that. You can hear Mrs. Chandler, the boarding house matron, already thumping down the hallway with her walking stick, rapping on doors like some kind of industrial-age rooster. "Up, girls! Up! The mills won't wait!" She takes her role seriously, this keeper of young women's morals and punctuality. The Lowell Mill Companies require their boarding house matrons to maintain strict oversight of their charges. Curfews at 10 o'clock, mandatory church attendance, no gentlemen callers, and absolutely no behaviour that might suggest you're anything less than a virtuous daughter of New England. Historians still argue whether this system was genuinely protective or simply another form of corporate control wrapped in the language of respectability. Sarah rolls out of bed beside you, her hair a catastrophic nest that she doesn't bother fixing. None of you do, really. You'll tie on your work bonnet in about 3 minutes, and it'll stay there, for the next 13 hours, so what's the point of vanity? The other girls are pulling on stockings, lacing boots with fumbling fingers, splashing water from the shared basin onto their faces. The water is so cold it makes your teeth ache. "Anyone else dream about being chased by looms?" asks Harriet, one of the younger girls who only started 2 months ago. She's still in that phase where she thinks the nightmares will stop. They won't. "Every night," you mutter, yanking your work dress over your head. The fabric is rough, homespun, deliberately plain. The mills prefer their workers to look respectable but not fashionable. Your dress is a faded blue-grey, the colour of exhaustion itself. You've been working at the Merrimack Manufacturing Company for 2 years now, ever since your father's farm hit hard times, and your family needed the cash wages only factory work could provide. The recruiting pamphlets made it sound almost romantic. Young women earning their own money, attending evening lectures, improving their minds. The reality tastes more like cotton lint and broken promises. You grab your shawl, thin wool that does almost nothing against the cold, and join the shuffle toward the stairs. 23 girls live in this boarding house, all crammed into rooms designed for half that number, all stumbling toward the same destiny, the red brick fortress of the textile mill visible from every window in town. Mrs. Chandler stands at the bottom of the stairs, counting heads, her lips moving silently. She'll report the count to the mill agent later, along with any behavioural concerns. It's all very efficient, very controlled, very much like being 17 and living in a prison that pays you $2 a week. The front door opens onto chaos. Girls are pouring out of boarding houses up and down the street, a river of shawls and bonnets and sleep-deprived faces flowing toward the mill gates. The streets are unpaved mud, or in winter, frozen ruts that twist ankles and ruin boots. You pick your way through the darkness, following the girl in front of you, who's following someone else, all of you following that damned bell that never stops ringing. The sky's just beginning to lighten in the east, a thin grey line that promises another day exactly like yesterday. Your stomach growls. There's no breakfast before work, just a hasty break. Later that you'll spend running back to the boarding house for whatever Mrs. Chandler has slopped into bowls. You pass the company store, dark and shuttered, where you'll spend your wages later on overpriced necessities. You pass the overseer's house, substantially nicer than your boarding house, warm light already glowing in its windows. And then you're there, at the gates, joining the crowd of workers, girls like you, plus the men who operate the heavier machinery, the children who work as doffers and sweepers. Everyone looks equally miserable in the pre-dawn gloom, and honestly, that's weirdly comforting. Misery loves company, especially when company is about 800 other people who also want to be literally anywhere else. The gate supervisor checks you in with a grunt and a mark in his ledger. You're here, you're on time. You've successfully completed the easiest part of your day. Now comes the actual work. The mill building looms above you like something out of a nightmare. 5 stories of red brick, hundreds of windows glowing with lamplight, and a tower that houses the bell you've grown to hate with religious fervour. The Merrimack Manufacturing Company complex sprawls across several acres, multiple buildings connected by covered walkways, all of it humming with a kind of mechanical anticipation. In a few minutes, this sleeping giant will wake up fully, and you'll spend the next 13 hours feeding it your youth, your health, and possibly your sanity. You shuffle through the main entrance with the crowd, everyone funneling through narrow doorways that create bottlenecks and irritation. The foreman, Mr. Hutchins, stands just inside with his pocket watch, his face set in that perpetual expression of disapproval he seems to have been born with. He's checking the time against each worker's arrival, and you can see him making little marks in his ledger for anyone cutting it too close. Being on time isn't enough. You need to be early enough that he doesn't consider you a time theft problem. The interior of the mill hits you with its own peculiar atmosphere, warmer than outside thanks to the boilers already heating water for the steam engine, but damp in a way that makes your dress cling. The smell is distinctive. Machine oil, cotton fibre, coal smoke, and human bodies packed too closely together. By day's end, you'll stop noticing it, the same way you stop noticing the sound of your own breathing. But right now, in these transitional moments between home and work, it all feels oppressively present. You head for the stairwell, the main one, wide enough for 3 workers abreast, borne smooth in the middle from thousands of feet making this same journey day after day. Your workstation is on the 3rd floor in the weaving room, where 60 power looms create a symphony of industrial violence that would make Beethoven weep. Some girls work on the 2nd floor with the spinning machinery, others on the 4th with the carding equipment. The 5th floor is mostly storage and the quarters where a few male workers sleep. Men who've given up on life outside the mill entirely, which honestly seems like surrendering to inevitability with extra steps. The stairwell echoes with footsteps and occasional conversation, though most workers are too tired for chatting at this hour. You pass a woman named Mrs. Fletcher, one of the older workers, maybe 35, which seems ancient from your teenage perspective, who's been here since the mill opened in the 1820s. She has a persistent cough that sounds like gravel in a tin can, and everyone knows it's from the cotton dust, but she can't afford to quit. Behind you, 2 young girls are whispering about a dance that's being organised for next month, their voices bright with the kind of optimism you remember having during your first few weeks. The 3rd floor opens onto a vast room that's still relatively dim. The sun won't rise for another hour, and the mill relies on oil lamps positioned between every few looms. The machinery stands silent for now, rows upon rows of wooden and metal frames stretching toward walls so distant they seem to vanish into shadow. It's almost beautiful in this quiet moment, if you ignore the fact that you know what's coming. Historians still argue whether the Lowell mill system was genuinely progressive for its time or simply exploitation with better marketing, but standing here in the pre-work silence, you think both things can be true simultaneously. You make your way to your station, loom number 47, 3rd row from the windows. You've worked this same spot for 18 months, and you know every quirk of this particular machine, the way it vibrates slightly to the left, the tendency for the shuttle to catch on the right side, the specific creaking sound that means something's about to jam. You check the warp threads automatically, running your fingers along them to feel for breaks or weak spots. Starting the day with damaged warp means hours of frustration later. Around you, other weavers are doing the same, a quiet ritual of preparation. Mary, who works the loom next to yours, gives you a tired nod. She's saving money to go west with her husband, though at the rate she's accumulating savings, you figure she'll be ready to leave sometime around 1890. 2 looms down, a new girl whose name you don't know yet is fumbling with her equipment, clearly overwhelmed. An older weaver, Abigail, is showing her the basics with the patience of someone who's trained dozens of replacements over the years. The windows along the east wall are starting to show the first real light of dawn, a cold, pale glow that does nothing to warm the room but at least lets you see better. In summer, these windows will be nailed shut to maintain humidity for the cotton fibres, turning the weaving room into a sauna that regularly causes girls to faint. In winter, they're merely frozen shut, which amounts to the same thing with less deliberate cruelty. Mr. Morrison, the overseer for your floor, emerges from his office near the stairs. He's a thin man with wire spectacles and a ledger that serves as his Bible, constantly recording production numbers, defect rates, and worker infractions. He walks the aisles between looms, checking that everyone's present and properly prepared. His eyes miss nothing: a loose hair that might get caught in machinery, a weaver who looks sick enough to contaminate others, any sign of the insubordination that mill management treats as a disease requiring immediate quarantine. Gates close in 3 minutes. He shouts, his voice carrying across the room. Anyone not at station by first bell forfeits morning pay! There's a final flurry of movement as the last stragglers rush to their positions. You see one girl, can't be more than 14, sprint across the floor and skid to a stop at her spinning frame, breathing hard. Mr. Morrison marks something in his ledger. She'll probably get a lecture later about professionalism and punctuality, because apparently running desperately to avoid losing wages isn't professional enough. You take your position at loom 47, hands resting on the frame, waiting. Your feet know exactly where to stand for the next 13 hours. There are worn spots on the wooden floor that match your boots. Around you, 80 other weavers stand at their looms in similar poses of resigned readiness. In the sudden quiet, you can hear the boilers in the basement, building pressure. You can hear the great leather drive belts starting to move, creaking and slapping against their pulleys. The first bell rings, 1 minute warning. You take a breath. The air still tastes relatively clean, not yet thick with the cotton fibres that will coat your lungs by noon. Someone near the windows coughs. Someone else mutters what might be a prayer or might be a curse. At this hour, they're basically interchangeable. Then the main bell. The great engine engages. The drive shaft begins to turn. The belts start moving in earnest, and your day actually begins. The noise is immediate and total. One moment you're standing in relative quiet, and the next moment the world ends in a cacophony of mechanical violence that makes conversation impossible and thinking barely feasible. 80-power looms roar to life simultaneously, their wooden frames shuddering, their metal parts clanging, their shuttles flying back and forth with a rhythmic bang 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 that will echo in your skull long after you leave tonight. If you've ever wondered what it sounds like inside a giant's watch while he's shaking it violently, well, congratulations, you're living the dream. The loom in front of you shakes into motion, and you instinctively step closer, your hands moving to guide the first shuttle through its trajectory. The shuttle is a wooden projectile about the size of a large potato wrapped with thread, and it flies from one side of the loom to the other, faster than you can fully track with your eyes. Miscatching it or guiding it wrong, and it'll slam into the frame, or worse, into you. Every weaver in this room has bruises on their hands and forearms from shuttle impacts. The more experienced workers have scars. Within minutes, the air changes. Cotton dust begins to fill the room like a very slow, very determined fog. It comes from every loom, every frame, every spool and bobbin, creating a haze that catches the lamplight and makes everything look soft and dreamlike, which would be lovely if it weren't also coating your lungs with fibre that has no business. Being inside a human body, you can taste it on your tongue, feel it in your throat, sense it settling into your chest with each breath. By lunchtime, you'll have a persistent cough. By evening, you'll be coughing up actual wads of cotton, and the mill doctors, when consulted, will suggest this is perfectly normal, and perhaps you should consider not being so delicate about industrial progress. The heat rises quickly. The steam engine in the basement powers the main drive shaft, which runs the length of the building and connects to every floor through a complex system of belts and pulleys that would be genuinely impressive if it weren't slowly killing everyone. That engine generates tremendous heat, and it rises through the building like the world's worst central heating system. Combined with 80 looms in constant motion, plus the body heat of 80 workers, plus the windows that won't open. The temperature in here will hit 90 degrees by mid-morning, even in winter. You settle into the rhythm because rhythm is everything in this work. The loom operates in cycles. The shuttle flies across. The beta bar slams the new thread into place. The harnesses lift to create a new opening. The shuttle returns. Your job is to watch for broken threads in the warp, catch the shuttle if it misbehaves, and keep the process flowing smoothly. It sounds simple when described like that. It is not simple. It requires constant attention for 13 hours, and attention is exhausting in ways that physical labour sometimes isn't. The light inside the mill is perpetually inadequate. Even now, with dawn breaking outside, the room remains dim. Those large windows you saw from the street don't transmit as much light as you'd hope, especially filtered through cotton dust and general grime. The oil lamps between stations provide islands of illumination, but they also produce smoke that adds to the respiratory adventure you're already experiencing. Mainstream historical accounts emphasize that the Lowell mills were better lit than many contemporary factories, which is technically true in the same way that being punched in the face is better than being punched in the face twice. Your loom develops its first problem around 6:15 a.m. A warp thread snaps near the back of the frame, and you have to stop everything to tie it back together. This requires reaching deep into the machinery, your fingers working blind in a space filled with moving parts, trying to locate two thread ends and knot them before Mr. Morrison notices you've stopped producing. The skill is called piecing, and it's something every weaver does dozens of times per day. Your fingers develop a kind of automatic knowledge, finding threads by feel, tying knots without looking, all while the looms around you continue their relentless percussion. The air vibrates. That's not metaphorical. The air literally vibrates from the combined effect of so many machines operating in one space. You can feel it in your chest, in your teeth, in your bones. Historians still argue whether the reported cases of mill fever and mysterious ailments among factory workers were genuine medical conditions or psychosomatic responses to industrial stress. But standing here with your organs gently liquefying from constant vibration, you're pretty sure the debate is academic in the worst possible way. Communication in this environment is nearly impossible. The noise level hovers around what modern OSHA would classify as hearing damage guaranteed. Though of course OSHA won't exist for another century, so you'll just have to discover the hearing loss yourself the old-fashioned way. Workers develop a kind of sign language, pointing, hand gestures, exaggerated mouthing of words. Some girls learn to read lips well enough to carry on conversations, though conversations is generous for exchanges like "thread broke" and "need help" and "I want to die." You glance down the row at Mary, who's already dealing with her own broken thread. Beyond her you can see the full scope of the weaving room, row after row of looms stretching toward the far wall, each tended by a worker whose posture exactly matches yours, slightly bent, perpetually alert, hands hovering near the machinery in a pose of constant readiness. It's like looking into a mirror that reflects your exhaustion 80 times over. The visual effect is sort of like a Renaissance painting depicting hell, if hell had better workplace safety protocols than this, and also probably better ventilation. A shuttle flies loose from a loom 3 rows over. You see it sailing through the air in a graceful arc before it smashes into a support beam with a crack that you can somehow hear even over the general roar. The weaver, a woman you vaguely recognize, scrambles to retrieve it while trying to stop her loom before it damages itself. Mr. Morrison's already striding toward her, ledger in hand, ready to record this moment of mechanical rebellion as evidence of worker incompetence rather than equipment failure. The cotton dust continues to accumulate. In the lamplight, the air looks thick enough to chew, and in a sense you are chewing it, breathing it in, swallowing it down, letting it coat every surface inside your respiratory system like the world's worst interior decoration. There's a bucket in the corner where workers can spit out the accumulation, though most girls just swallow it rather than leave their stations. The bucket is disgusting anyway, a fact that doesn't stop you from using it occasionally when the alternative is choking. Your feet already hurt and it hasn't even been an hour. You'll stand here in this same spot until the breakfast bell rings around 7:30 a.m. Then you'll have 30 minutes to sprint back to the boarding house, consume whatever passes for food, and sprint back before the next bell. Then you'll stand here until the dinner break at noon, then more standing until the evening bell finally releases you around 6:30 or 7 p.m., depending on how the production quota looks. The machinery roars, the dust swirls, the shuttles fly, the threads break and get pieced and break again, and you've only just begun. You are, whether you like it or not, part of a phenomenon. The term mill girl gets thrown around in newspapers, reform pamphlets, and company propaganda with varying degrees of respect and condescension. But what it really means is this. You're one of approximately 10,000 young women currently working in New England textile mills, the largest concentration of female wage workers in American history up to this point. Congratulations on being a statistic in the Industrial Revolution's greatest social experiment, which may or may not be slowly poisoning you with cotton particles. The story of how you ended up here probably mirrors that of most girls in this room. You grew up on a farm, in your case, a struggling property in rural New Hampshire, where your father raised dairy cows and occasional hope, both of which died with distressing regularity. The soil was rocky, the growing season short, and the profits non-existent. When the recruitment agent came through town in 1843 with his polished boots and promises, your father listened with the desperate attention of a man watching his family's future crack like thin ice. The agent had pamphlets, glossy, printed pamphlets with engravings of neat brick buildings and wholesome young women engaged in respectable labour. The text described opportunities for self-improvement, cash wages, moral supervision, and the chance to accumulate a dowry while improving your mind through evening lectures and lending library access. It painted factory work as something almost noble, a temporary adventure for virtuous daughters of New England before they returned home to marry well and live comfortably. The pamphlets did not include engravings of cotton dust, or mention that the moral supervision would feel less like protection and more like surveillance. Your parents saw dollar signs and relief. $2 per week, cash money, sent home to help keep the farm afloat. And you? You saw escape. Escape from milking cows at dawn, from the same 6 families you'd known your entire life, from the very specific suffocation of a small town where everyone knew your business and your prospects, were limited to marrying someone equally poor and starting the whole cycle over again. The mills promised something different, something modern, something that felt like the future even if you couldn't articulate exactly what that meant. Mainstream historians love to emphasize that these early Lowell mills genuinely were more progressive than typical industrial operations of the era. The workers were housed in company boarding houses rather than left to fend for themselves in slums. They were paid in cash rather than company scrip. They had access to cultural institutions and were encouraged to educate themselves. All of this is true. It's also true that better than the worst possible alternative is a low bar that the mills cleared while still being fairly terrible places to spend 13 hours per day. Thousands of girls made the same calculation you did. Farm daughters, mostly, aged roughly 15 to 30, though the average skews young because older women tend to either marry out or break down from the work. You came from New Hampshire. Mary beside you came from Vermont. Harriet in the next row came from rural Massachusetts. You're all part of the same demographic wave, daughters of struggling Yankee farmers, drawn to industrial wages because agriculture was failing, and women had virtually no other options for cash employment beyond domestic service, which paid less and offered even fewer freedoms. The reality you discovered upon arrival was complex. The wages were real, which distinguished the Lowell system from outright fraud. You genuinely do earn about $2 per week after board, which is more money than you'd ever seen on the farm. But the work is harder than anything you'd imagined, the hours longer, the living conditions more constrained, and the promises of intellectual improvement mostly theoretical when you're too exhausted to read by evening lamplight. There's a quirky historical detail that the recruitment pamphlets definitely didn't mention. The mills calculate your productivity down to the fraction. Every week, Mr. Morrison tallies how many yards of cloth each weaver produced, and those numbers get compared against quotas, against your fellow workers, against last month's output. Fall behind, and you'll receive a quiet talk about your future employment prospects. Exceed quota consistently, and you might earn an extra 25 cents, which the company treats like a lavish bonus despite the fact that you've essentially worked faster to generate more profit for people who already own brick mansions. The demographics of mill work have been shifting, even in the 2 years you've been here. When the first Lowell mills opened in the 1820s, the labour force was almost exclusively native-born New England farm daughters, girls like you, but operating under even more idealistic delusions about industrial work. By the 1840s, Irish immigrants are beginning to appear in the mills, usually relegated to the lowest paying positions but gradually changing the workforce composition. Historians still argue whether the shift from Yankee to immigrant labour was driven by native workers demanding better conditions or by companies deliberately replacing troublesome American girls with more desperate foreigners. But standing here in a room full of increasingly dissatisfied New Englanders, you suspect the answer involves both factors, plus a healthy dose of capitalist opportunism. The grand social experiment aspect of the mill girl phenomenon was supposed to prove that factory work could be compatible with virtue and femininity. The mill owners, wealthy Boston investors known collectively as the Boston Associates, genuinely believed, or at least claimed to believe, that they were creating a new model of industrial capitalism that avoided the squalor and degradation of English factory towns, the boarding house system, the moral oversight, the cultural opportunities. These were supposed to demonstrate that American manufacturing could uplift its workers rather than destroy them. You're not feeling particularly uplifted at the moment, watching your looms sputter through another broken thread while your lungs gradually convert to cotton fibre storage units. But you're also aware that girls in English mills have it worse. Longer hours, lower pay, children starting work at age 5, entire families trapped in factory tenancies with no escape. The Lowell system is better than that. It's just not better enough to match the promises in those glossy pamphlets that lured you here with dreams of independence and self-improvement. The recruitment continues, of course. Even as experienced workers like you grow cynical and tired, new girls arrive monthly from distant farms, their eyes bright with the same hopes you had 2 years ago. You watch them stumble through their first weeks, struggling with machinery and noise and the sudden shock of industrial discipline. Some quit within days. Some adapt and survive. Some, like you, settle into a kind of exhausted endurance that might last years or might end suddenly when your body decides it's had enough. Meanwhile, the looms keep running, the cloth keeps rolling out, and the mills keep recruiting fresh farm daughters to replace the ones who collapse, marry, or finally save enough money to leave. The phenomenon continues. You're still part of it. Lucky you. Let's talk about what you actually do for 13 hours a day, because textile worker sounds almost quaint until you break down the reality of tending a power loom that's actively trying to maim you while producing cotton cloth for people who will never know your name. Your job title is weaver, though machine babysitter who occasionally bleeds might be more accurate. You're responsible for 2 looms. Yes, 2, because the mill decided a few years ago that 1 loom per worker was inefficient, and efficiency is apparently more important than your sanity or physical limitations. Each loom is about 6 feet wide and 4 feet deep, a wooden and metal framework that transforms thread into fabric through a process that seems designed by someone who really enjoyed the concept of repetitive motion injury before that term existed. The basic mechanics are straightforward in theory. Warp threads run lengthwise through the loom, held under tension. The shuttle carries the weft thread back and forth across the warp. After each pass, the beta bar slams the new weft thread into place, with a satisfying bang that you'll be hearing in your sleep for the rest of your life. Your primary task is vigilance. You watch both looms constantly, scanning for problems that occur with depressing regularity. Broken warp threads are the most common issue. They snap from tension or weakness, and when they do, the loom immediately starts producing defective cloth. You need to spot the break within seconds, stop the loom by pulling the leather strap that disengages it from the drive belt, reach into the machine while other nearby looms continue operating inches from your fingers, locate both ends of the broken thread, tie them together with a weaver's knot that takes about 3 seconds when you're experienced, and restart the loom before Mr. Morrison notices you've stopped production. You perform this sequence approximately 40 to 60 times per day, per loom. With 2 looms, you're piecing broken threads over 100 times during your shift, each instance requiring you to thrust your hands into moving machinery, each instance carrying the risk of catching a finger or hand in the mechanisms. Mainstream historical records indicate that hand and finger injuries were the most common workplace accidents in textile mills, often resulting in permanent disfigurement or amputation, which the mill owners considered an acceptable cost of doing business. The shuttle presents its own delightful hazards. It's supposed to fly smoothly from one shuttle box to the other, but sometimes it catches, jams, or goes rogue entirely. A shuttle travelling at full speed carries enough force to break bones if it hits you squarely, and every weaver in this room has been struck at least once. You've got a permanent bruise on your left forearm from a shuttle impact 2 weeks ago that turned the entire area purple-black and made simple tasks like lifting your arm an adventure in pain management. The quirky historical detail that rarely makes it into textbooks. Some mills eventually installed shuttle guards after too many workers lost eyes to flying projectiles. But your mill hasn't adopted this innovation yet because spending money on safety equipment apparently violates some sacred principle of profitable operation. Dodging shuttles becomes instinctive. You develop a kind of peripheral awareness, sensing when a shuttle is behaving erratically, moving your body fractionally to avoid impact while your hands continue working. It's like playing a very boring, very dangerous video game where the only reward for success is not getting injured, and the penalty for failure is medical bills you can't afford. The physical position you maintain is its own special torture. You stand for the entire shift, 13 hours with only brief breaks for meals. No sitting, no leaning, no resting. Just standing in the same spot, bent slightly forward to see the work clearly, arms extended to reach the looms, neck craned to watch both machines simultaneously. Your back develops a persistent ache around hour 3 that intensifies throughout the day, until by evening it feels like someone's driving nails into your spine. Your feet swell inside your boots until the leather cuts into your ankles. Your shoulders burn from the constant reaching and lifting. The noise makes concentration exhausting in ways that are hard to explain to people who've never experienced it. You're not just hearing the looms, you're feeling them, vibrating through the floor, through the air, through your bones. Your brain has to work overtime to filter signal from noise, to detect the specific sounds that indicate problems, the slight change in rhythm that means a thread is broken, the rattling that suggests a shuttle is about to jam, the grinding noise that means something expensive is about to break and you'll probably be blamed for it. Speed is everything. The mills measure productivity in yards per day, and there's constant pressure to increase output. A skilled weaver can produce roughly 50 yards of cloth per shift, though this varies based on the type of fabric and the quality of the materials. You're expected to maintain this pace while also ensuring quality. No broken threads visible in the finished cloth. No irregularities in the weave, no defects that would downgrade the product. Fall below standard, and Mr. Morrison will be having words with you about your future employment prospects. Exceed standard consistently, and you might earn bonus pennies while destroying your body slightly faster. The repetitive nature creates a kind of trance state. Hours blur together in an endless cycle of watching, piecing, adjusting, watching, piecing, adjusting. Your mind wanders while your hands work automatically. You think about home, about the letter you need to write to your mother, about whether you'll ever save enough money to leave, about what you'd do if you could do anything at all besides stand here feeding thread to a machine that doesn't care whether you live or die. Historians still argue whether the transition from home-based textile production to factory work represented liberation or oppression for women, and honestly, standing here with your back screaming and your hands bleeding from tiny cuts and your lungs full of cotton dust, you think maybe both things can be simultaneously true, and also entirely beside the point when the immediate reality is just trying to survive until the dinner bell. The looms roar, your hands move, the cloth grows inch by inch, and you've still got 8 hours left in your shift. Mr. Morrison is watching you. He's always watching you, actually, which is his entire job description boiled down to its essence. Walk the aisles between looms, observe workers for signs of slacking or incompetence or unapproved human emotion, and record infractions in that leather-bound ledger he carries like it's a sacred text. He's maybe 40 years old, thin in the way that suggests either moral superiority or digestive problems, with wire-rimmed spectacles that reflect lamplight in a way that makes his eyes look blank and mechanical. If there were a factory that produced middle management enforcers, Mr. Morrison would roll off the assembly line as their premium model. He paces. That's his constant state. Pacing up and down the rows between the looms around the support pillars, creating a circuit that ensures no worker goes more than a few minutes without direct observation. His footsteps are somehow audible even over the roar of machinery, a rhythmic click, click, click of hard-soled boots on wooden floors that triggers an instinctive tension in your shoulders every time you hear it approaching. It's Pavlovian, really. Boot clicks equal potential trouble, and your body has learned to maintain a performance of maximum productivity whenever he's nearby. The overseer's power is absolute within his domain. He controls your wages through a complex system of fines and deductions that can reduce your weekly pay to almost nothing if he decides you've committed sufficient infractions. Talking during work hours? Fine. Moving too slowly between your looms? Fine. Producing cloth with visible defects? Fine. Taking too long to piece a broken thread? Fine. Looking insufficiently industrious even if you're actually working perfectly well? Fine, because apparently your face is also subject to quality control standards. The ledger is his weapon of choice. Every time he stops beside a worker, you can see him making little marks and notations, cryptic symbols that translate into economic punishment later when wages are calculated. A check mark might mean a quarter day's pay deducted. A circled number could indicate a more serious infraction worth half a day's wages. There's no appeal process, no worker representation, no way to contest his judgments. Mr. Morrison's ledger is law, and you're subject to his interpretation of your worth down to the fractional cent. Communication with him is nearly impossible thanks to the noise level, which he uses to his advantage. He'll mouth words at you across the roar of looms, and you're expected to understand immediately and respond appropriately. You've gotten moderately skilled at reading lips. Most workers develop this ability out of sheer survival necessity, but it's an imperfect art. You've been fined before for failing to respond to direct instructions, when the reality was that you simply couldn't decipher what he was saying through the mechanical cacophony and cotton dust haze. Trying to explain this feels like arguing with a brick wall that can dock your pay, so mostly you just nod and hope you've understood correctly. The surveillance extends beyond just watching for poor work quality. Mr. Morrison is equally invested in monitoring worker behaviour, attitudes, and social interactions. He'll appear suddenly behind you when you're trying to exchange a few words with Mary at the next loom, his presence alone enough to cut the conversation dead. Speaking during work hours is officially prohibited, though the rule is enforced selectively. Some overseers ignore brief exchanges, while Mr. Morrison treats any human interaction as evidence of dangerous insubordination that must be crushed before it spreads. Mainstream historical analyses emphasize that the overseer system was designed to maintain production standards and ensure quality control in an era before automated monitoring. This is technically accurate in the same way that describing a prison guard as ensuring facility security is technically accurate while missing certain nuances about power dynamics and human dignity. The overseers were the mill owner's eyes and ears on the floor, translating capitalist profit motives into daily harassment of workers who couldn't afford to push back. Mr. Morrison has his favourites, of course. There's a weaver named Catherine 2 rows over who never seems to get fined despite producing cloth at roughly the same rate and quality as everyone else. She's young, pretty in a conventional way, and has mastered the art of looking grateful for his attention, while subtly deflecting anything inappropriate. Historians still argue whether the prevalence of favouritism and harassment in early industrial settings was worse than in domestic service or agricultural work. But the existence of the debate feels less important than the fact that Catherine has clearly learned to navigate an uncomfortable reality through a combination of performance and strategic boundary setting. The quirky detail that rarely makes it into factory history. Overseers were often former workers themselves, men who'd started as labourers and worked their way up through demonstrating loyalty to management over solidarity with fellow workers. Mr. Morrison supposedly operated a spinning mule on the second floor for 5 years before his promotion, which means he knows exactly how difficult this work is and chooses to enforce impossible standards anyway. Nothing builds character quite like being supervised by someone who's familiar with your suffering and has decided it's your own fault. You watch him stop beside Harriet, the younger worker who still has nightmares about looms. He's pointing at her cloth, shaking his head, making marks in the ledger. Harriet's face crumples. You can see her fighting tears, which is dangerous because crying would be another infraction, probably filed under emotional instability unsuited to factory work. Whatever she did wrong, it's going to cost her, and there's nothing she can do about it except absorb the criticism and try harder, which is exactly the response the system is designed to produce. The power dynamic is nakedly exploitative, and everyone knows it. Mr. Morrison needs workers to meet production quotas, but he also needs to maintain enough fear and discipline that no one questions the conditions or organizes resistance. It's a balancing act. Push too hard and workers quit or rebel, push too soft and productivity slips. He's managed to find the sweet spot of maximum pressure with minimum consequences, which from a management perspective is probably impressive, and from a human perspective is completely horrifying. He's approaching your looms now, and you instinctively straighten your posture, make your movements more precise and purposeful, radiate an aura of dedicated competence even though you were doing the exact same work 30 seconds ago. This is what surveillance does. It makes you perform productivity rather than simply be productive, burning extra energy on the appearance of diligence because the reality of your work isn't enough without the theatrical component. Mr. Morrison stops, looks at your cloth, runs his finger along the weave, checking for irregularities. His face reveals nothing, no approval, no criticism, just blank assessment. You hold your breath, waiting. Finally, he nods fractionally and moves on. No marks in the ledger this time, which feels like a victory even though you've literally just done your job at the baseline acceptable level. The click, click, click of his boots recedes toward the next row. Your shoulders relax marginally. You've survived another inspection. Until the next one, approximately 12 minutes from now. The breakfast bell clangs at 7:30 a.m., and the weaving room transforms into barely controlled pandemonium. 80 looms don't stop gradually. They all disengage simultaneously as workers pull their drive straps, creating a sudden comparative silence that's somehow more shocking than the noise was. Your ears ring in the absence of sound, a high-pitched whine that will persist throughout the break and probably for the rest of your natural life. The machinery shudders to stillness, and for exactly 3 seconds there's this weird collective pause as everyone's brains adjust to the fact that we're allowed to stop moving, stop watching, stop being productive humans serving mechanical masters. Then the stampede begins. 80 weavers converge on the stairwell simultaneously, joined by workers from other floors, all funneling toward the narrow exits in a crush of bodies and desperation. You've got 30 minutes, actually 28 now, because the scramble to stop your looms and join the crowd took 2 minutes. To get back to your boarding house, consume whatever Mrs. Chandler has prepared, and return before the bell signals work resumption. Latecomers forfeit their morning wages, which translates to roughly 25 cents lost for arriving even 1 minute after the deadline. That's a significant chunk of your weekly pay, so the pressure to sprint like you're being chased by wolves is not metaphorical. It's pure economic mathematics. The stairs are a hazard. Too many people moving too fast down wooden steps worn smooth by years of similar desperate descents. Someone always trips, causing a ripple effect of stumbling and cursing that would be comical if you weren't actively participating in it. You grab the railing and let yourself be carried along by the human current, your feet barely touching the steps as the crowd propels you downward. The air in the stairwell is thick with cotton dust dislodged from everyone's clothing and hair, creating a haze that makes the whole exodus look like some kind of industrial exodus through biblical fog. Out the main doors and into the street, where the morning has progressed to full daylight, cold, grey, utterly indifferent to your situation. January air hits your overheated face like a slap, and you're simultaneously too hot from the mill's interior and too cold from inadequate outerwear. The street is chaos. Workers from multiple mills all heading toward their respective boarding houses in a mad dash that makes the town look like it's being evacuated ahead of an invading army. Except the invading army is just capitalism with a strict schedule and punitive wage policies. You run, actually run, which is unladylike and undignified and absolutely necessary. Your skirts are heavy and awkward, your boots slip on frozen mud, your lungs burn from sudden exertion after 2 hours of standing relatively still. Around you, other mill girls are doing the same, lifting their hems to move faster, skidding around, corners, calling out warnings about ice patches and obstacles. Mainstream historical accounts often mention that mill girls were encouraged to maintain respectable feminine deportment, which is hilarious when observed against the reality of twice-daily sprints through unpaved streets like you're fleeing a natural disaster. Your boarding house is 3 streets away, normally a pleasant 5-minute walk, but you're covering it in under 2 minutes through sheer terror of wage loss. Mrs. Chandler's building appears ahead, and you can see other girls from your house converging from different directions, all red-faced and breathing hard. You burst through the front door into the dining room, where the table is already set with bowls and spoons and the general atmosphere of institutional feeding. The breakfast itself is a joke that stopped being funny around your second week. Porridge. Always porridge. Sometimes it's oat porridge, sometimes it's cornmeal porridge, and on special occasions it's wheat porridge. But the consistent factor is that it's porridge of some description, served lukewarm and with the consistency of paste someone found behind a bookshelf. There's molasses to sweeten it, which helps marginally, and milk if you're lucky enough to grab a seat near the pitcher before it runs out. Historians still argue whether the boarding house diet was nutritionally adequate for factory workers expending tremendous energy, and you'd like to invite those historians to live on porridge for 2 years and report back on their findings. 23 girls crowd around a table designed for 15, elbows knocking, spoons clacking, everyone shoveling food into their mouths with the frantic energy of people who know the clock is ticking. There's no conversation, no time for it, and besides, everyone's too focused on consuming calories as quickly as physically possible. You grab an empty seat, claim a bowl, dump molasses over the grey sludge masquerading as nutrition, and begin eating with mechanical efficiency. The porridge tastes like regret and unfulfilled promises, is also probably the only substantial food you'll get until the dinner break at noon, so you force it down despite your stomach's protests. Around you, girls are doing the same, some eating so fast they're visibly choking, others dunking hard bread into the porridge to soften it enough for consumption. The quirky historical detail that rarely makes it into textile industry studies. Boarding house keepers could increase their profits by serving the cheapest possible food, and the mill companies didn't care as long as workers showed up for shifts, creating a perverse incentive structure where your nutrition was subordinate to Mrs. Chandler's bottom line. You check the clock on the wall, 15 minutes left. That means you've got maybe 3 more minutes to eat before you need to start the return journey. You shovel faster, burning your mouth on a particularly hot pocket of porridge that apparently concealed volcanic properties beneath its grey surface. Someone near the end of the table is crying quietly while eating, tears running down her face as she mechanically spoons food into her mouth. Nobody comments on it. Crying during breakfast is just part of the routine, like the porridge itself. Mrs. Chandler appears from the kitchen, surveying her charges with the critical eye of someone assessing livestock. 12 minutes, girls, she announces, as if you weren't all acutely aware of the time pressure. And Sarah, you've got a letter from home. Collect it after your shift tonight. Sarah's face brightens momentarily before returning to the default expression of exhausted endurance that everyone wears like a uniform. 10 minutes. You scrape the last of the porridge from your bowl, swallow a final gulp of milk and push back from the table. Other girls are doing the same, a synchronized evacuation as everyone calculates the minimum time needed to sprint back to the mill. Some workers will use the privy now, there's one outhouse for 23 girls, creating its own special morning chaos, while others will hold it until the dinner break rather than risk being late. You skip the privy. Your bladder can wait 4 more hours. Probably. You grab your shawl from the hook by the door and step back into the cold morning, joining the reverse stampede of workers heading back toward their respective mills. Mrs. Chandler doesn't just feed you terrible porridge twice a day. She owns you in ways that would make medieval feudal lords nod with professional respect. The boarding house keeper occupies a unique position in the Milltown ecosystem. Part landlady, part prison warden, part moral guardian, and entirely an extension of the mill company's surveillance apparatus. She's employed directly by the Merrimack Manufacturing Company, her salary dependent on maintaining the kind of strict oversight that ensures her boarders remain productive, docile, and sufficiently virtuous that their employment doesn't embarrass the mill owner's carefully constructed narrative about uplifting American womanhood through industrial labor. The rules are extensive, posted on a board in the front hallway where you can't possibly miss them, though Mrs. Chandler also recites them regularly as if you might have developed sudden amnesia about your own restrictions. Curfew is 10 p.m. sharp, the front door locks, and if you're not inside, you're sleeping elsewhere and probably getting fired tomorrow. No male visitors under any circumstances, not even brothers or fathers, because apparently the mere presence of men in the building might cause spontaneous moral collapse. Mandatory church attendance every Sunday at a congregation approved by the mill company, with Mrs. Chandler personally noting who skips services and reporting absentees to the mill agent. No alcohol, no card playing, no dancing except at company-sanctioned events, no reading material that Mrs. Chandler deems inappropriate, which seems to include anything more stimulating than agricultural almanacs and religious tracts. She enforces these rules with the dedication of someone who genuinely believes that young women require constant supervision to prevent their natural tendency toward wickedness and ruin. Every evening she conducts informal inspections, walking the hallways, listening at doors, checking who's where and doing what. You've learned to be quiet during these patrols, to look appropriately industrious if you're reading or sewing, to never give the impression that you might be enjoying yourself too much, or thinking thoughts that might lead to moral degradation, or, worse, labour organising. The boarding house itself reflects this philosophy of controlled femininity. Your room, shared with 5 other girls, is furnished with the absolute minimum: 2 beds, 1 small dresser, pegs on the wall for hanging clothes, a wash basin that all 6 of you share. There's no heat except what rises from the kitchen below, which means winter nights are an exercise in piling every blanket you own onto the bed and still waking with frost on the inside of the window. The walls are thin enough that you can hear conversations from neighbouring rooms, which means Mrs. Chandler can probably hear you too, creating a panopticon effect where privacy is theoretical at best. Mainstream historical accounts emphasise that the boarding house system was genuinely progressive for its era, providing young women with safe, supervised housing in an age when unattached females living independently were assumed to be prostitutes or equally disreputable. This is accurate. It's also true that the system functioned as a mechanism of social control that extended the mill company's reach into every aspect of workers' lives, blurring the line between employment and indentured servitude in ways that would make modern labour organisers weep with frustration. Mrs. Chandler reports directly to the mill agent, a gentleman named Mr. Pemberton who lives in a mansion on the hill and rarely dirties his hands with actual factory oversight, but maintains meticulous control over the town's social order. Once a month she delivers her assessment of each boarder's moral character, work ethic, and general suitability for continued employment. A bad report from Mrs. Chandler can get you fired just as surely as poor production numbers, and she knows it, wielding this power with the selective mercy of someone who enjoys having authority over people who can't fight back. The quirky historical detail that rarely makes it into discussions of industrial paternalism: boarding house keepers could earn bonuses based on worker retention and good behaviour, creating a financial incentive to maintain strict discipline, while also not being so oppressive that everyone fled. Mrs. Chandler has apparently found the sweet spot, strict enough to satisfy the mill company, but not quite brutal enough to trigger mass departures. It's a delicate balance that requires a specific personality type: authoritarian, suspicious, moralistic, and just competent enough at basic hospitality that the porridge is merely terrible rather than actively poisonous. Your relationship with her is complicated by necessity. You need her approval to maintain employment, but you also resent her constant surveillance and the way she treats grown women like children requiring correction. She's maybe 50 years old, widowed, with no children of her own but plenty of opinions about how young women should behave. She genuinely seems to believe that mill girls are prone to moral failure without firm guidance, that the temptations of town life, such as they are, require constant vigilance to prevent disaster. The evening routines under her watch are regimented to the point of absurdity. Dinner is served at 7 p.m, immediately after you return from the mill. You have 1 hour to eat, wash, and prepare for the next day before quiet time begins at 8 p.m. During quiet time, you're expected to engage in improving activities: reading, approved materials only, sewing, letter writing, Bible study. Conversation is permitted but should be kept to reasonable volumes. Laughter is viewed with suspicion, as if joy itself might be evidence of moral laxity. At 9 p.m, Mrs. Chandler begins her final rounds, checking that everyone is in their assigned rooms, that no unauthorized activities are occurring, that the general atmosphere reflects the kind of sober respectability that the mill companies use in their propaganda. She carries a lamp and her ever-present ring of keys, the clinking sound announcing her approach like a jailer making evening rounds. By 9:30, you're expected to be in bed, or at least pretending to be, because staying up late suggests you have insufficient respect for the morning bell's authority. The 10 p.m. lockdown is absolute. The front and back doors both get locked, bolted, and checked. Anyone outside at lockdown stays outside, and Mrs. Chandler will definitely report your absence to Mr. Pemberton in the morning. You've seen girls get fired for breaking curfew. Not immediately, but through a careful process where their hours get reduced, their assignments become more difficult, and they're quietly pushed out through a combination of economic pressure and social ostracism. The mill companies prefer not to fire workers outright for rule violations, if they can instead make conditions unpleasant enough that workers quit voluntarily, which looks better in the recruitment pamphlets. Historians still argue whether the boarding house system was primarily protective or primarily exploitative, and honestly, you think they're asking the wrong question. It's both, simultaneously, in ways that make simple moral judgments difficult. Mrs. Chandler does keep you safe from certain dangers: predatory men, housing scams, the kind of exploitation that befell unprotected women in urban areas. She also controls every aspect of your life beyond the factory floor, extending the company's reach into your sleeping hours, your social interactions, your private thoughts. She stands now in the doorway as you leave for your return sprint to the mill, counting heads again, making sure all her charges are accounted for. Her expression is stern but not unkind. She's not cruel by nature, just convinced that strict oversight is necessary for your own good. Whether you agree with that assessment is entirely irrelevant to the power dynamic at play. You nod respectfully as you pass, because antagonizing Mrs. Chandler would be strategically foolish, and head back into the cold morning for the return journey. The mill bell is already ringing its warning. 5 minutes until work resumes. You run faster. You make it back through the mill gates with maybe 90 seconds to spare, which feels like a victory until you remember that you've basically just sprinted half a mile to preserve the privilege of standing at a loom for another 5 hours before the next break. The machinery roars back to life at precisely 8 a.m, and you're back in position at loom 47, hands moving automatically, brain still processing the fact that you consumed approximately 400 calories of terrible porridge to fuel 13 hours of physical labor that burns roughly 3,000 calories, which is math that doesn't work in your favor, but nobody asked your opinion about it. Let's talk about money. Actual money. The reason you're here instead of milking cows on your father's farm or working as a domestic servant for some wealthy family in Boston. The mills pay cash wages, real American dollars and cents that you can hold in your hand, count, and spend on whatever you choose. This is genuinely revolutionary in an era when most women's economic contributions are unpaid labor within family structures, or compensated through room and board rather than currency. The mill girls earn wages. This fact gets emphasized in company propaganda, reform literature, and the personal letters you write home to make this whole experience sound better than it actually is. The numbers work like this. You earn approximately $50 per week as a weaver. Not exactly a fortune, but compared to the $0 per week you earned on the farm, it feels significant. Except, and this is where the mathematics of exploitation get interesting, the mills immediately deduct $1.25 per week for your boarding house fees, so that impressive $250 shrinks to $125 in actual take-home pay before you've even had a chance to appreciate your earning potential. Mrs. Chandler gets her cut first, deducted automatically by the mill company, which means you never even see half your theoretical wages. But wait, there's more deductions. The mill also charges you for the lamp oil used to light your workstation, roughly 10 cents per week. There's a maintenance fee of 5 cents weekly for general, building upkeep, which is hilarious considering the windows don't open and the floor hasn't been properly cleaned since approximately 1827. If you damage any equipment, break a shuttle, snap too many threads through carelessness, cause any malfunction that Mr. Morrison decides was your fault, those repairs get deducted too. Last month, your loom's beta bar cracked during operation, obviously from metal fatigue and years of constant use, but Mr. Morrison determined it was due to improper handling, and you lost 50 cents from your pay to cover the replacement part. Your actual weekly wage, after all deductions and assuming you haven't committed any infractions that result in fines, typically lands somewhere between 1.0 and 1.50 on a good week. When nothing breaks, nobody reports you for talking or slowness, and Mr. Morrison isn't feeling particularly punitive about quality standards. This is more money than you'd earn as a domestic servant, maybe 75 cents to $1 weekly for live-in household work, but not by the dramatic margin the recruitment pamphlet suggested. And domestic servants don't generally inhale cotton dust or risk losing fingers to machinery. So there's a quality of life calculation that the simple wage comparison doesn't capture. Mainstream historical analyses emphasize that mill wages gave women unprecedented economic independence, the ability to accumulate savings, and freedom from total dependence on fathers or husbands. This is true. It's also true that unprecedented is doing heavy lifting in that sentence, because going from zero economic power to marginal economic power still leaves you pretty far from actual independence. You can technically spend your wages however you want, but after covering necessities like boots that don't leak, stockings to replace the ones destroyed by constant standing, and maybe occasional postage to write home, your purchasing power isn't exactly transformative. The company store presents its own mathematical adventure. You're not legally required to shop there, but it's conveniently located, extends credit when you're short on cash, and employs subtle pressure tactics to ensure worker patronage. The prices are roughly 20 to 30% higher than independent shops in town, but those shops don't offer credit, and when you've got 15 cents to your name 3 days before payday, credit starts looking pretty attractive. Historians still argue whether company stores were primarily convenient amenities or deliberate debt traps designed to keep workers financially dependent, but your personal experience suggests the answer involves both factors, plus a healthy dose of captive market price gouging. You send money home when you can. Usually about 50 cents per month makes it back to your family's farm in New Hampshire, helping with property taxes or seed purchases or whatever crisis has emerged since your last letter. Your parents appreciate the contribution, though you suspect they'd imagine larger remittances based on the recruitment agent's promises. The gap between mill girls can earn up to $250 weekly, and mill girls actually take home $125 after deductions and might manage to save $200 monthly if nothing goes wrong, is the kind of discrepancy that makes you wonder whether the recruitment agent genuinely believed his own pamphlets or was just really committed to creative interpretation of wage structures. The quirky economic detail that rarely makes it into labour history. Some mill girls engaged in small-scale entrepreneurship to supplement wages, taking in sewing, selling handicrafts, tutoring literacy, creating tiny informal economies within the boarding house system. You've considered this, but the problem is that after 13 hours in the mill, you barely have enough energy to feed yourself dinner, let alone produce marketable goods for additional income. The girls who successfully maintain side businesses are either exceptionally energetic or exceptionally desperate, possibly both. Your savings, such as they are, live in a small cloth bag tucked under your mattress. Currently, 340 Sven. You've been working for 2 years. The mathematics there are depressing enough that you try not to think about them too directly. At this rate, you'll accumulate enough for a modest dowry in approximately never, and the dream of returning home to marry well and live comfortably recedes further with each passing month of diminishing returns on your physical labour. The independence you'd imagined, the freedom that cash wages supposedly provided, looks quite different in practice. Yes, you're earning money. Yes, you technically control how you spend it. But between deductions, living expenses, family obligations, and the basic costs of surviving as an industrial worker, your economic autonomy is more theoretical than actual. You're trapped in a system that pays you just enough to make leaving difficult, but not enough to accumulate real freedom. The looms roar, your hands move, the cloth grows, and your wages shrink before they ever reach your pocket. The cough starts around your 3rd month in the mill. At first it's barely noticeable, a little tickle in your throat that you clear away without thinking. By month 6, it's a regular companion, a dry hack that punctuates your days and keeps you awake at night. By year 1, you're coughing up actual wads of cotton fibre, small grey clumps that you spit into handkerchiefs or, more often, just swallow back down because stopping to spit properly would mean leaving your looms unattended. By year 2, which is where you are now, the cough is simply part of who you are, as integral to your identity as your name or your perpetual exhaustion. Welcome to what the workers call cotton lung, and what the mill doctors call weak constitution, or hereditary respiratory deficiency, or on particularly creative days, insufficient moral fibre manifesting as physical symptoms. The medical establishment has opinions about your lungs, and those opinions uniformly avoid acknowledging that perhaps, just maybe, spending 13 hours daily inhaling textile particles might have consequences for respiratory health. That would be inconvenient for the mill companies, who prefer to maintain that their factories are healthful environments that only harm workers who are already predisposed to illness through personal weakness or poor genetics. The reality is that every long-term mill worker develops some degree of lung damage. The cotton dust that fills the air in such picturesque clouds isn't just atmospheric decoration. It's particulate matter that your lungs were never designed to process. Each breath deposits more fibre into your respiratory system, coating the delicate tissues, accumulating in the tiny air sacs, slowly transforming your lungs from functional organs into something resembling badly stuffed pillows. Mainstream medical literature from the 1840s acknowledges respiratory ailments among textile workers, but generally attributes them to factors like poor personal hygiene, inadequate ventilation at home, or the worker's own failure to maintain healthful habits, rather than, the obvious occupational hazard of breathing cotton for most of your waking hours. Your hearing is also deteriorating, though this happens so gradually that you don't fully notice until you realize you're reading lips more than listening to words. The constant roar of machinery, operating at noise levels that would horrify future occupational health experts if those experts existed yet, damages the delicate structures of your inner ear irreversibly. By the time you've worked here 5 years, you'll probably have significant hearing loss. By 10 years, if you last that long, you'll likely be substantially deaf. The quirky historical detail that nobody mentions in the uplifting narratives about industrial progress. An entire generation of mill workers went progressively deaf, and this was considered normal, acceptable, and entirely the worker's problem to manage rather, than an occupational injury deserving of compensation or prevention. Then there are the visible injuries, the ones that manifest in missing fingertips, mangled hands, and permanent scars that map the geography of industrial accidents across workers' bodies. You've still got all 10 fingers, which makes you luckier than several women in this room. The woman 2 looms over is missing her left index finger from a shuttle accident 3 years ago. Another weaver lost 2 fingers when her hand got caught in a loom's mechanisms during a threading operation. The company's response to these injuries is remarkably consistent. The worker was careless, should have been more attentive, clearly lacked the proper temperament for factory work, and will receive no compensation beyond whatever the company doctor charges to stitch up the damage, which gets deducted from future wages. The mill doctor, Dr. Thornton, a man whose medical degree probably came from somewhere accredited, but whose diagnostic skills seem limited to, "You're fine, get back to work," and "It's your own fault," holds monthly office hours in a small room adjacent to the mill agent's office. You visited him once about the cough, and he listened to your lungs with his stethoscope, pronounced them adequately functional, and suggested you might benefit from avoiding excessive exertion outside work hours. When you pointed out that the cough started after you began mill work and worsens throughout each shift, he smiled indulgently and explained that correlation doesn't imply causation, which is technically true but spectacularly unhelpful when you're coughing up textile fibers. Tuberculosis stalks the boarding houses like an invisible predator. The combination of cramped sleeping quarters, poor nutrition, exhausted immune systems, and constant exposure to lung irritants creates perfect conditions for the disease to spread. Last year, 3 girls from Mrs. Chandler's house contracted TB. 2 died within months, and the 3rd was sent home to her family to die more slowly. The mill company's response was to thoroughly clean the boarding house, by which they meant Mrs. Chandler aired out the bedrooms for one afternoon, and continue operations as normal. Historians still argue whether tuberculosis rates were higher among mill workers than the general population, or whether the disease simply became more visible in concentrated industrial communities. But standing here watching another worker succumb to a racking cough that sounds suspiciously familiar, you're not particularly interested in the statistical nuances. The company maintains that worker health is a priority, while doing absolutely nothing to improve conditions that cause illness. Ventilation could be improved by opening windows, but that would affect humidity levels and fiber quality, so the windows stay nailed shut. Noise levels could be reduced through better machinery maintenance and soundproofing, but that costs money without increasing production, so the deafening roar continues. Safety equipment could prevent injuries, but spending money on worker protection apparently violates some sacred principle of industrial efficiency, so fingers get mangled and everyone just accepts it as the cost of employment. You've developed a persistent pain in your lower back that radiates down your left leg, probably from the constant standing and the posture required to tend looms. Your feet have permanent calluses and occasional infections from boots that don't fit properly, but which you can't afford to replace. Your hands sport numerous small scars from thread cuts, shuttle impacts, and the general violence of interacting with machinery designed without consideration for human fragility. You're 19 years old and already accumulating the kind of physical damage that people twice your age might expect. But hey, at least you're earning wages. That's supposed to make it all worthwhile, right? The independence, the cash money, the opportunity to destroy your body for profit while the mill owners live in mansions, and the doctors assure you that your deteriorating health is somehow your own moral failing. The cough continues, your hearing fades, the machinery roars, and Dr. Thornton maintains that you're perfectly healthy, just weak. The dinner bell rings at noon, and you experience the same Pavlovian relief you felt at breakfast. Temporary cessation of machinery, blessed comparative silence, the chance to rest your screaming feet for 45 whole minutes. The weaving room goes through its mechanical death throes as looms disengage, and once again you're part of the stampede toward the stairwell, though this time the urgency is slightly less frantic, because the dinner break is 15 minutes longer than breakfast. 15 minutes. The mill companies are generous like that, giving you a whole quarter hour of additional rest during which you can really savour the watery soup and contemplate your life choices. The noon rush is different from the morning chaos. There's less sprinting and more determined walking, though walking still involves moving faster than any reasonable definition of strolling would suggest. Your feet hurt enough now that running feels actively dangerous, so you join the crowd moving at that peculiar mill girl pace. Not quite running, not quite walking, something in between that maximizes speed while minimizing the risk of falling and breaking something important. The streets are busier at midday, shopkeepers are open, townsfolk are conducting business, and the sight of hundreds of factory workers flooding toward boarding houses creates a spectacle that the town has grown accustomed to, but which still feels vaguely apocalyptic in scale. Mrs. Chandler has the dining room ready when you arrive, which is to say she's ladled soup into bowls and placed them on the table in a formation that suggests military precision rather than hospitality. The soup is a triumph of making something from nearly nothing. Today it appears to be potato-based, though potato-based is generous when you count 3 actual potato chunks in your entire bowl, and the rest is vaguely starchy water with flecks of unidentifiable vegetables that gave up their will to live sometime during the cooking process. There's also bread, hard, dense bread that could probably serve as a building material if the construction industry ever needs something more durable than brick. You sit and eat because the alternative is starvation, and your body needs fuel even if that fuel tastes like regret, flavoured with salt and broken dreams. The soup is hot at least, which is something. It burns your mouth in the same spots that the morning porridge burned, creating a pleasant symmetry of oral damage. Around you, 23 girls are performing the same ritual of consumption, spoons moving mechanically from bowl to mouth, jaws working through bread that requires serious commitment to chew properly. The conversation is minimal because everyone's too focused on eating and resting. Your feet throb with each heartbeat, a pulsing reminder of the 4 hours you've already stood and the 5 more hours waiting after this break ends. You slip off your boots under the table, which provides maybe 30 seconds of relief before the air hits your swollen feet, and you realize that getting the boots back on is going to be its own special adventure. Mainstream historical analyses note that mill girls often developed serious foot problems from prolonged standing on hard floors. But what those analyses miss is the specific horror of watching your ankles swell so dramatically that your boots leave deep impressions in your flesh like you're being slowly consumed by leather. "Anyone else's loom running fast today?" asks Sarah from across the table, her voice barely above a whisper despite the fact that we're allowed to talk during meals. That's what the mill does. It trains you to be quiet even when silence isn't required, conditioning you like one of those laboratory dogs that salivate when they hear bells. You all salivate too, but it's from cotton dust accumulation, rather than food anticipation. "Morrison cranked up the speed yesterday afternoon," someone responds, "trying to hit quota before the monthly count. This is normal. The overseers will periodically increase the machinery speed to boost production, which means you're working harder for the same pay while risking more broken threads and equipment malfunctions. It's efficiency at its finest, if efficiency means extracting maximum labour from humans who can't effectively protest." The quirky historical detail that food historians love: Sunday dinner is the only substantial meal of the week in most boarding houses. Mrs. Chandler actually serves meat on Sundays, usually boiled beef or pork, tough and gristly but recognisably animal protein, along with potatoes and maybe a vegetable that hasn't been boiled into complete submission. This weekly feast is supposed to compensate for 6 days of nutritional minimalism, operating on the theory that the human body can survive on starch and hope as long as it gets occasional protein infusions. Whether this actually works is questionable, but the mill companies cite Sunday dinners as evidence that they care about worker nutrition, which is technically true in the sense that complete starvation would reduce productivity. You finish your soup and bread in approximately 8 minutes, which leaves 37 minutes to rest before the return journey. Some girls use this time to visit the privy, a more leisurely affair than the morning rush, while others simply sit with their feet up, eyes closed, trying to store rest like batteries charging for the afternoon shift. You choose the latter, leaning back in your chair and letting your eyes drift shut, listening to the ambient sounds of the boarding house, Mrs. Chandler clattering in the kitchen, other girls murmuring quiet conversations, the clock ticking away your precious rest minutes. 20 minutes left. You should probably use the privy now, before the pre-return rush begins. Your bladder has opinions about the 4 hours since breakfast, and ignoring those opinions until the evening break seems unwise. You force your boots back onto your swollen feet, a process that involves gritting your teeth and questioning your life choices, and join the small line forming outside the outhouse. 15 minutes, back inside, where some girls are already gathering their shawls and preparing for the return walk. The atmosphere shifts from rest to reluctant preparation, everyone mentally transitioning from blessed break to back to work mode. You can see it in postures, in expressions, in the way conversations trail off as the reality of 5 more hours of standing reasserts itself in everyone's consciousness. 10 minutes. You're at the door now with the early departures, those workers who'd rather arrive with time to spare than risk cutting it close. The midday sun provides no warmth. January doesn't care about your comfort or your swollen feet, or the fact that you're about to spend 5 more hours inhaling cotton dust while tending machinery that actively wants to maim you. The walk back is slower than the morning sprint, but faster than any reasonable pace, your boots pinching with each step, your stomach processing the meagre nutrition you've provided. Other workers stream alongside you from different boarding houses, all flowing back toward the mills like rivers running downhill toward an inevitable destination. The bell rings its 5-minute warning as you pass through the gates. You climb the stairs. You find your station. You wait. And the machinery roars back to life, swallowing the afternoon whole. Sunday, the Lord's Day. You're 1 day off from the mills, except it's not really a day off so much as a day when you're required to perform different, unpaid labour for the benefit of your soul and the mill company's public image. The church bell starts ringing at 8 a.m, which is luxuriously late compared to the factory bell, but still earlier than any reasonable person would choose to wake after 6 days of industrial servitude. You drag yourself out of bed, the same bed you collapsed into last night around 8 p.m. because you were too exhausted to do anything else, and begin the process of making yourself presentable for mandatory worship. The outfit requirements are specific. Your best dress, which is still fairly shabby but at least doesn't have visible stains from cotton dust or machine oil. Clean apron, hair properly arranged under a bonnet that Mrs. Chandler inspects with the critical eye of someone whose own employment depends on ensuring her charges don't embarrass the company through inadequate grooming. Stockings without holes, boots polished to a shine that suggests you're a respectable young woman, engaged in dignified labour, rather than someone who spends 65 hours weekly being slowly destroyed by textile machinery. Mrs. Chandler conducts a full boarding house inspection before departure, checking that everyone meets her standards for church-appropriate appearance. She's particularly attentive to details that might suggest moral laxity: hair too loosely arranged, dresses cut even slightly lower than absolute modesty demands, any hint of rouge or face powder that would indicate vanity. The goal is to present the mill girls as wholesome daughters of New England, living proof that factory work hasn't corrupted them into the kind of degraded urban labourers that English factories produce. You're supposed to look healthy, virtuous, industrious, and grateful for the opportunity to destroy your lungs for wages. The walk to church is a collective performance. All the boarding houses empty simultaneously, creating a parade of properly dressed young women moving through town toward the first congregational church, the mill-approved congregation where you're all expected to worship. The mill companies have strong opinions about religious affiliation, preferring traditional Protestant denominations that preach values compatible with industrial discipline: hard work, obedience to authority, acceptance of earthly suffering, and the virtue of knowing your place in the social order. Mainstream historical accounts emphasize that religious attendance was encouraged to provide moral guidance and community support, which is technically true while ignoring that encouraged meant mandatory with employment consequences for non-compliance. Mr. Pemberton, the mill agent, stands outside the church entrance with his wife, greeting workers as they arrive and making subtle marks in a small notebook he carries. He's recording attendance, noting who's present and who's conspicuously absent, because apparently God's omniscience needs assistance from middle management. The Pembertons represent the pinnacle of Milltown society. He manages the entire Merrimack operation, lives in a mansion that would make your family's farmhouse look like a tool shed, and wields absolute power over workers' employment, while maintaining the friendly demeanour of someone who's never personally experienced financial anxiety. "Good morning, ladies," he says warmly as your boarding house group approaches. "Wonderful to see such faithful attendance." His smile is genuine in the way that people who benefit from systemic exploitation can be genuinely pleasant on individual levels. Mrs. Pemberton stands beside him, looking like an advertisement for comfortable middle-age prosperity. Her dress probably costing more than you'll earn in 3 years. Her expression radiating benevolent interest in the welfare of the working classes from a safe social distance. You file into the church, which is actually a beautiful building. White clapboard, tall windows, a proper pipe organ that someone plays with genuine skill. The mill companies spared no expense on the church because it serves important propaganda purposes. Look at how well we treat our workers, providing them with access to spiritual enrichment in architecturally significant houses of worship. The pews fill up with workers from various mills and boarding houses, along with overseers, mill agents, shopkeepers, and other town residents, creating a cross-section of industrial hierarchy rendered temporarily equal in the eyes of God, but still very much unequal in every practical sense. The seating arrangement is telling. The Pembertons and other mill management sit in the front pews, the expensive seats that wealthy families purchase or rent annually. The overseers and their families occupy the middle section. Workers fill the back and sides, packed closely together, which is fine because you're used to being packed closely together, and at least church pews don't vibrate with mechanical violence. Mr. Pemberton's notebook is still visible in his lap, and you can see him occasionally glancing back to confirm attendance, probably cross-referencing faces against his mental ledger of employee names and behavioural concerns. The service itself is standard New England congregationalism, scripture readings, hymns that everyone sings with varying degrees of enthusiasm, and a sermon delivered by Reverend Hutchins, who coincidentally happens to be the brother-in-law of one of the mill owners, and whose theological interpretations reliably support industrial capitalism as God's plan for human flourishing. Today's sermon focuses on the parable of the talents, which he interprets as divine endorsement of hard work, personal responsibility, and the moral obligation to maximize productivity with the gifts God has given you. The subtext, that questioning your working conditions or organizing for better treatment would be rejecting God's plan, goes unstated but lands clearly enough. The quirky historical detail that religious historians love. Some mill girls genuinely found comfort and meaning in these services, using church as a space for legitimate spiritual connection and community building that transcended the surveillance apparatus. Others performed attendance while internally rejecting the theology, treating Sunday worship as just another work requirement to be endured. And some developed a complicated relationship where genuine faith coexisted with resentment about mandatory attendance and sermons that seemed designed to keep workers compliant. Historians still argue whether the mill company's religious requirements were primarily about social control or genuine concern for workers' souls, but sitting here listening to Reverend Hutchins explain how earthly suffering builds character that will be rewarded in heaven, you're pretty sure the answer involves both factors with heavy emphasis on the control aspect. The service lasts 90 minutes, which would feel interminable except you're sitting down and not operating machinery, so it qualifies as rest by comparison. Your feet throb less. Your lungs get a break from cotton dust. Your ears recover slightly from the constant roar, though the organ music during hymns is loud enough that recovery might be optimistic. You sing when required, bow your head during prayers, and maintain the appearance of engaged worship while your mind wanders to more pressing concerns, like whether your boots will last another month, or how you'll afford new stockings when your current ones inevitably develop more holes. The service ends with a benediction and final hymn, and then you're released back into the cold January morning with the rest of your Sunday ahead. A few precious hours of relative freedom before evening prayers and the knowledge that tomorrow the factory bell rings again at 4:45 a.m. Mr. Pemberton stands at the exit, shaking hands and reminding workers about the evening prayer service at 6 p.m., which is also technically mandatory, though enforcement is slightly less rigid than morning attendance. His notebook is closed now, attendance confirmed, everyone present and accounted for like inventory successfully warehoused. You file out into the winter sunlight, properly worshipped and surveilled. Only 6 more days until you get to do this again. The company store sits prominently on Main Street, impossible to miss and strategically positioned between your boarding house and the mill, a geographical arrangement that's definitely coincidental and not at all designed to make shopping there the path of least resistance. The sign reads, Merrimack Provisioners, quality goods for quality workers, which is advertising copy so creative it borders on fiction. You need new stockings because your current pair has developed holes that expose your ankles to both cold air and Mrs. Chandler's disapproving glances, so Sunday afternoon finds you pushing through the store's front door with the resigned determination of someone about to be financially exploited but lacking viable alternatives. The interior is actually quite nice. Clean wooden floors, well-organised shelves, good lighting from large windows, and a selection of goods that ranges from absolute necessities to items you'd categorise as things rich people buy. There's dry goods, fabric, ready-made clothing, shoes, toiletries, writing supplies, candy, tobacco for the male workers, and basically everything a mill employee might need to survive. The shopkeeper, Mr. Dawson, is a pleasant man in his 50s who greets you with the warm familiarity of someone who knows exactly how much debt you're carrying because he maintains the ledger that tracks it. "Afternoon, miss. How can I help you today?" His smile is genuine, which somehow makes the whole enterprise feel more insidious. If he were openly hostile, at least you could hate him properly. Instead, he's friendly and helpful, making it easy to forget that he's part of a system designed to recapture your wages before you can actually spend them anywhere else. "Stockings, please," you say, moving toward the women's goods section. The stockings are displayed on a shelf with clear price markers, 60 cents per pair. You know for a fact that the independent dry goods store 3 streets over sells comparable stockings for 45 cents, a price difference of 15 cents that represents roughly 10% of your weekly wages. But the independent store doesn't offer credit, and you currently have 18 cents to your name because it's 3 days before payday, and you already spent most of last week's wages on necessities and that letter home to your family. Mr. Dawson follows you to the shelf, helpfully pulling down options for your inspection. These are our finest cotton stockings, very durable. The girls tell me they last quite well. He's not lying. The quality is decent, which is part of what makes the pricing so frustrating. You're not being sold garbage at inflated prices. You're being sold reasonable goods at prices marked up just enough to ensure maximum profit extraction, while remaining defensible as fair market value for quality merchandise. "I'll take 1 pair, you say, because you need them, and you can't afford 2 pairs anyway. On credit, please." This is where the trap closes gently around your financial throat. Mr. Dawson produces the credit ledger, a massive book containing the purchasing history of every mill worker who shops here, which is basically every mill worker because the alternative is having money on hand when you need things, and that's adorable but unrealistic given your wages. He opens to your page, which shows your current outstanding balance, $1.47, representing previous purchases of thread, soap, a handkerchief, and writing paper for letters home. "That'll bring your total to $2.07, he says, making the notation with careful penmanship, payable from your next wage distribution, of course. Of course, the mill companies deduct company store debts directly from your pay, the same way they deduct boarding fees and lamp oil and equipment damage. It's automated wage recapture. You earn money, and before you ever touch it, significant portions get redirected back to various company-affiliated enterprises. Mainstream economic historians note that company stores provided convenient credit access for workers who otherwise couldn't obtain loans, which is true in the same way that being punched in the face once is better than being punched in the face twice. Technically an improvement, but still fundamentally a violence. The credit system works like this. You can charge purchases up to roughly 75% of your anticipated weekly wages. The store doesn't charge explicit interest. That would look too much like predatory lending and damage the mill company's carefully maintained image of benevolent paternalism. Instead, they simply price everything high enough that the markup functions as implicit interest. You pay 15 cents more per item than you would elsewhere, which over the course of a year amounts to significant profit for the store, while keeping you perpetually unable to accumulate savings that might enable shopping at cheaper independent merchants. There's also a subtle social pressure component that the recruitment pamphlets definitely didn't mention. The mill agents and overseers pay attention to where workers shop. Patronizing the company store demonstrates loyalty and integration into the mill town system. Shopping exclusively at independent stores suggests you might be the kind of troublemaker who puts personal interest over company solidarity, which is exactly the sort of attitude that gets noted in those ledgers that overseers maintain. It's not official policy. Nothing is ever official policy when it comes to soft coercion. But girls who avoid the company store tend to find themselves receiving less favourable job assignments and more frequent wage deductions for quality issues. The quirky economic detail that business historians love: company stores could generate profits equal to 15 to 20% of worker wages, effectively recapturing a significant portion of the labour cost the mills paid out. The workers earned $2 weekly but spent 40 cents of it at inflated prices in company stores, creating a circular flow where wages left workers' pockets and returned to company coffers with impressive efficiency. It's almost elegant in its exploitation, a closed-loop system that gives workers the experience of earning and spending money while ensuring maximum value extraction at every step. You take your new stockings and head toward the door, your debt now increased, your next paycheck already partially spoken for. Mr. Dawson waves cheerfully as you leave. "See you next week, miss. And don't forget, we just received a shipment of lovely winter shawls if you're interested." You are interested, because your current shawl is inadequate for January weather, but you're also aware that purchasing a shawl would increase your debt to levels that would consume your entire next paycheck, leaving you with zero cash and forcing you into more credit purchases in a spiral that some workers never escape. Outside, you pass Mary heading into the store on her own errand. "Don't buy the shawls," you warn her. "They're beautiful and we can't afford them." She sighs. "Probably going to buy one anyway. My mother always said I had terrible judgment about money." Your mother never worked in a company store system designed to trap her in perpetual debt, you point out. "Fair," she concedes, and disappears inside to make her own financially questionable decisions. You walk back toward the boarding house, new stockings in hand, debt increased, wages already spent before you've earned them. The trap is sprung. You're caught. Welcome to economic independence, mill girl style. Your bedroom, and using the singular your, is generous when the space is shared by 6 human beings who'd rather not be this intimately acquainted with each other's sleeping habits, personal hygiene practices, and emotional breakdowns, occupies roughly 180 square feet on the 3rd floor of Mrs. Chandler's boarding house. For those keeping track, that's 30 square feet per person, which is less space than many people allocate to their closets, but apparently sufficient for the full-time residence of exhausted factory workers who just need somewhere to collapse between shifts. The room contains 2 beds, 1 dresser, a wash basin, 6 pegs on the wall for hanging clothes, and a pervasive atmosphere of resigned coexistence that occasionally tips into active hostility over whose stockings are whose and who forgot to empty the chamber pot again. The beds are standard double beds, designed for 2 people sleeping side by side, except you've got 3 girls per bed, which transforms sleeping into a nightly negotiation of space, blanket distribution, and who gets stuck in the middle position where you're simultaneously too warm from body heat and unable to move without disturbing your bedmates. You currently share with Sarah and a newer girl named Elizabeth, who kicks constantly in her sleep and once elbowed you so hard in the ribs that you thought you'd cracked something. The other bed holds Harriet, Mary, and an older worker named Catherine, who snores with the volume and regularity of a small steam engine, creating a soundtrack for your nights that makes actual rest feel like an optimistic goal rather than an achievable reality. The dresser is a 4-drawer unit that serves all 6 of you, which means you get 2/3 of 1 drawer for your entire personal wardrobe and possessions. Your allocation currently contains 1 spare work dress, 2 shifts that serve as undergarments, the new stockings you just purchased on credit, a few handkerchiefs, a hairbrush you share with Sarah, and a small collection of letters from home that you've saved because they're literally the only personal items you own that aren't clothing. Everything else you brought to the mill town, a few books, a nice shawl your mother made, some ribbons, has been gradually sold or left behind as you've learned that owning things requires space you don't have, and security you can't guarantee in a room where nothing locks, and privacy is a theoretical concept discussed in philosophy books, but never actually experienced. The sleeping arrangements create intimacy that none of you wanted. You know exactly how Sarah smells after a work shift. Sour sweat mixed with cotton dust and machine oil. You know that Harriet cries quietly at least twice a week, trying to muffle the sound in her pillow but never quite succeeding. You know that Elizabeth talks in her sleep, usually about her family's farm back in Vermont, and that Mary grinds her teeth so loudly it sounds like someone operating a tiny mill inside her skull. You know these things because you can't not know them when you're literally sleeping inches apart with no walls, no curtains, no barriers between your exhaustion and theirs. The chamber pot situation deserves its own historical treatise on the intersection of sanitation, privacy, and human dignity. There are 2 chamber pots for 6 women, positioned under the beds for nighttime use, because walking downstairs to the outhouse in January, darkness is both dangerous and forbidden after 10 p.m. lockdown. The unspoken rule is that you empty your own pot in the morning, carrying it downstairs to the designated disposal area before the morning rush to the mill. The reality is that people sometimes forget, deliberately or through genuine exhaustion, leaving the task for others, which creates resentment that accumulates like interest on company store debt. Last week there was a genuine argument about chamber pot responsibilities that nearly escalated to physical violence before Catherine intervened with the weary authority of someone who's too old for this nonsense. Privacy is non-existent. You dress and undress in front of 5 other people because there's literally nowhere else to do it. The shared wash basin means you're all intimately familiar with each other's morning routines. Who washes thoroughly, who does the bare minimum, who's developed a rash that's probably spreading because you're all sharing the same water and towel. Mainstream historical accounts emphasize that boarding house living taught young women valuable lessons about communal living and cooperation, which is one way to describe the experience. Another way would be to say that it strips away any illusion of personal space and forces you to either adapt to constant observation or lose your mind completely. And honestly, some days you're not sure which option you've chosen. The temperature varies from uncomfortably cold in winter to marginally less uncomfortably cold in the brief periods when heat rises from the kitchen below. There's no fireplace in the room. Fire hazards in wooden buildings packed with textile workers are taken seriously after several horrific boarding house fires in other mill towns, so you rely on whatever warmth reaches you through the floor and whatever body heat 6 women generate when packed into 180 square feet. Winter nights involve piling every blanket, shawl and spare piece of fabric onto the beds and still waking with cold feet and numb fingers. Summer nights involve different torture, suffocating heat with no air circulation because the single window doesn't open wide enough to provide meaningful ventilation. The interpersonal dynamics are complicated by exhaustion, competition, and the basic reality that humans aren't designed to live in this kind of proximity without developing tensions. Small infractions become major issues. Someone borrowing a hairbrush without asking, someone taking more than their fair share of drawer space, someone snoring keeping everyone awake, someone's crying disturbing what little sleep others manage to get. You've developed alliances. You and Sarah are friendly, united partly by sharing the bed and partly by arriving at the mill around the same time. But you've also got barely suppressed conflicts with Elizabeth, who's messy and inconsiderate in ways that grate after 13-hour work shifts when tolerance is already at minimum levels. The quirky sociological detail that housing historians love, these cramped boarding house arrangements created intense female communities that could be simultaneously supportive and suffocating. Girls shared information about which overseers were worst, which workers to avoid, how to manage the work, where to buy things cheaply. They also shared illnesses, conflicts, rumours, and occasionally belongings that disappeared under mysterious circumstances that everyone suspected but nobody could prove. The close quarters forced cooperation while also amplifying every minor annoyance into potential crisis. Mrs. Chandler conducts weekly inspections of the sleeping rooms, checking for cleanliness, unauthorized items, and any evidence of behavior she'd consider inappropriate. This means that even your tiny allocation of personal space isn't truly yours. It's subject to surveillance, subject to rules about what you can own and how you can arrange it, subject to the same controlling oversight that governs every other aspect of your life in this mill town. You're lying in bed now, middle position between Sarah and Elizabeth, trying to find a comfortable arrangement that doesn't involve someone's elbow in your side or someone's feet on your shins. The room is cold, the blanket's inadequate, Catherine's snoring already building to crescendo. Tomorrow the bell rings at 4:45 a.m, and you'll wake cramped and sore from sharing a bed designed for 2 people with 3 exhausted bodies. But hey, at least you've got a roof over your head. The company makes sure you're appropriately grateful for that. January is miserable, but at least it's the misery you've grown accustomed to. The cold walks to and from the mill, the frozen mud streets that twist ankles and ruin boots, the way your fingers go numb during the pre-dawn journey, and take 20 painful minutes to regain feeling once you're inside near the machinery. You've adapted to winter, developed strategies for survival, extra layers that you shed once the mill's heat becomes oppressive, wool stockings that itch but provide essential warmth, a shawl that's inadequate but better than nothing. Winter is terrible, but it's a known terrible, and humans can adapt to almost anything if it's consistent enough. What you're not prepared for is summer, which transforms the textile mill from merely difficult working conditions into something that resembles a deliberate experiment in how much heat a human body can endure before complete system failure. The temperature outside on a July afternoon might hit 90 degrees, which is hot but manageable if you're sitting in shade with a cool drink and nothing to do. Inside the mill, with 80 power looms generating mechanical heat, steam engines pumping warmth from the basement, and the windows nailed shut to maintain humidity levels for fibre processing, the temperature regularly exceeds 110 degrees. Sometimes it hits 120. The air becomes thick enough to chew, saturated with moisture and cotton dust, creating an atmosphere that's part sauna, part respiratory hazard, and entirely unbearable for 13 continuous hours. The windows, remember those large windows that looked so promising from outside, are nailed shut from May through September. This is deliberate company policy, not architectural oversight. Cotton fibres require specific humidity levels to process correctly, and opening windows would allow dry outside air to lower humidity and affect product quality. The mill companies have calculated that worker comfort is less important than fibre consistency, which is probably the most honest assessment of their priorities you'll encounter. Mainstream historical records confirm that textile mills intentionally sealed windows during summer months, with some facilities going so far as to spray water on floors to increase humidity, creating conditions that modern occupational health experts would classify as criminally negligent, but which 1840s mill owners considered optimal for production. You've seen girls faint. Multiple times per shift during summer months, workers simply collapse, their bodies reaching the limits of heat tolerance and shutting down as a protective measure. The protocol is grimly efficient. Other workers drag the unconscious girl to a relatively clear space near the walls. Someone splashes water on her face, and if she regains consciousness within a few minutes, she's expected to return to her loom. If she doesn't wake quickly, she gets carried to the mill doctor's office, where Dr. Thornton will diagnose weak constitution or hysteria and send her home without pay for the day, because apparently fainting from heat exhaustion is a personal failing rather than a predictable response to working in temperatures that would make Satan himself complain about the office climate. The summer routine includes adaptations that sound reasonable until you remember the baseline conditions. The mill allows workers to bring small containers of water to their stations. Generous. Except the water becomes lukewarm within an hour, and you're drinking cotton dust-flavoured liquid that does little to address the fundamental problem of standing in a sealed building that's hotter than the exterior temperature of most contemporary ovens. Some girls soak handkerchiefs in water and drape them around their necks, creating tiny zones of evaporative cooling that provide maybe 90 seconds of relief before the handkerchiefs become hot, wet cloths that stick to your skin and make everything worse. The dress code remains unchanged regardless of season, because modesty and respectability don't take holidays for weather. You're still wearing multiple layers, shift, dress, apron, despite the fact that you're essentially standing inside an industrial furnace for most of your waking hours. The fabric clings to your skin, soaked with sweat that never dries because the humidity prevents evaporation. By mid-morning, your dress is plastered to your body, creating visible outline of your undergarments that would scandalize Mrs. Chandler if she could see it. But fortunately, she's not standing in the weaving room slowly cooking alongside everyone else. The quirky historical detail that costume historians find fascinating. Mill girls' dresses from summer months often showed permanent salt stains from dried sweat, creating white rings and patterns that no amount of washing could remove, essentially creating accidental tie-dye effects through the intersection of labour conditions and human perspiration. Winter, by contrast, presents the opposite problem with equal disregard for worker welfare. The morning walks to the mill happen in complete darkness, with temperatures often below zero, wind cutting through inadequate clothing, ice making streets treacherous. You've developed chilblains, those painful inflammations of small blood vessels that occur from repeated exposure to cold, on your toes and fingers, creating permanent itching and occasional open sores that hurt constantly, but which you can't address because stopping work to deal with minor injuries isn't permitted unless you're actively bleeding enough to damage the cloth. Inside the mill during winter, the temperature is more tolerable than summer, probably 75 to 80 degrees once the machinery gets running, but the journey to and from work remains brutal. You've seen girls slip on ice and break bones, struggle through snowdrifts that reach their knees, arrive at the mill with frostbitten extremities that Dr. Thornton treats with the same dismissive efficiency he applies to all worker ailments. The mill companies maintain that weather is beyond their control, and workers should simply dress appropriately, which is excellent advice except that appropriate winter clothing costs money you don't have and wouldn't be warm enough anyway when you're walking through pre-dawn darkness in January gales. The mills never close for weather. Never. Historians still argue whether the uninterrupted production schedules of New England textile mills contributed to their competitive advantage over other manufacturing regions. But standing here sweating through your dress in July or walking through a blizzard in February, you're pretty confident that the competitive advantage is built directly on worker suffering, that management considers an acceptable business cost. Snow, ice, heat waves, thunderstorms, none of it stops the morning bell, none of it grants you reprieve from the expected 13-hour shift. Spring and fall provide brief windows of tolerability, maybe 6 weeks total per year, when the temperature inside the mill doesn't require active survival strategies beyond the baseline challenge of not getting injured by machinery. During these magical periods, you can almost imagine that factory work might be bearable if conditions were always like this. Then summer arrives and reminds you that comfort is temporary, or winter returns and freezes away any illusions about industrial progress, creating better lives for workers. The seasons change, the weather varies, your suffering adapts to whatever nature provides. But the looms never stop running, and neither do you. The wage cut announcement comes on a Wednesday in February, posted on a notice board near the mill entrance where everyone will see it during the shift change. The words are bureaucratic and polite, explaining that due to market conditions and competitive pressures from southern manufacturers, the Merrimack Manufacturing Company finds it necessary to reduce wages by 15% effective next month. This translates to a loss of roughly 37 cents from your weekly pay, dropping you from approximately $2.50 to $2.13 before deductions, which means your actual take-home shrinks from maybe $1.25 to around 88 cents. The notice is signed by Mr. Pemberton with his characteristic flourish, as if his elegant penmanship somehow softens the reality that you're about to become measurably poorer while doing the exact same backbreaking work. The reaction among workers is immediate and volcanic. Groups cluster around the notice board, reading and rereading the words as if they might rearrange themselves into something less catastrophic. Voices rise, anger, disbelief, desperation mixing into a collective fury that you've rarely witnessed in the normally subdued workforce. Sarah stands beside you, her face pale, doing the mental math that you've already completed. 88 cents weekly means she'll never save enough to leave, never accumulate the modest dowry she'd hoped for, never escape the cycle of work and debt that already feels inescapable. They can't do this, someone mutters, which is adorable in its optimism because of course they can do this. The mill companies can do essentially whatever they want, raise quotas, cut wages, speed up machinery, fire workers without cause, because you have no leverage, no union representation, no legal protections against employer decisions. The power dynamic is so one-sided it's almost elegant in its brutality. You work or you starve, and the mills know it. But something is different this time. Maybe it's the accumulated weight of years of poor treatment. Maybe it's the specific economic pressure of wage cuts when workers are already barely surviving. Or maybe it's just that sometimes people reach a breaking point where self-preservation requires collective action, even when individual action seems safer. Whatever the catalyst, by evening, word is spreading through the boarding houses. Turnout meeting tomorrow after shift at the town green. Turnout, the polite New England term for what other places might call a strike, a work stoppage, a withdrawal of labour in protest of intolerable conditions. The Lowell Mill girls have turned out before. In 1834, roughly 800 workers walked out to protest wage reductions, creating one of the first organised labour actions by women in American history. In 1836, another turnout over boarding house fee increases brought production to a halt for several days. Both times, the protests eventually collapsed. Workers couldn't sustain themselves. Without wages, the mill companies waited them out, and eventually everyone returned to work under essentially the same conditions with a few cosmetic concessions. Mainstream historical accounts emphasize that these early turnouts demonstrated workers' willingness to resist exploitation and marked important moments in American labor history, which is absolutely true while also acknowledging that the turnouts largely failed to achieve their immediate goals, and the workers who organized them often faced lasting consequences. You attend the meeting because not attending feels like betraying something important, even though you're terrified of the potential repercussions. Several hundred women gather on the green in the cold February evening, breath visible in the lamplight, faces showing the same mix of determination and fear that you're feeling. A woman named Sarah Bagley, a respected weaver who's been in Lowell for years, stands on a makeshift platform addressing the crowd. Her voice carries across the green, articulating grievances that everyone feels but rarely speaks aloud. The wages that barely cover survival, the speed-ups that demand more work for the same pay, the arbitrary fines and deductions, the health costs that mill doctors ignore, the surveillance and control that extends into every aspect of workers' lives. "We have laboured faithfully for these companies," Bagley declares. "We have damaged our health, sacrificed our youth, and asked for nothing but fair compensation for honest work. And their response to our dedication is to cut our wages while their owners grow richer from our labour." The crowd murmurs approval, and you can feel the collective energy building, anger transforming into something that might actually become organised resistance if enough workers commit to action. The proposal is simple and terrifying. All workers stay home tomorrow, refusing to enter the mills until the wage cut is rescinded. No violence, no property destruction, just a complete withdrawal of labour that would halt production and cost the companies money until they negotiate. It's a straightforward plan that requires nearly impossible solidarity. Hundreds of workers simultaneously choosing collective action over individual survival, trusting that others will maintain the turnout even when hunger and debt create powerful incentives to defect. The risks are substantial, and everyone knows it. The mill companies maintain blacklists, shared databases of troublemaking workers who'll never be hired at any New England textile mill again. Organisers get blacklisted automatically. Visible participants in turnouts often get blacklisted. Sometimes just attending meetings like this one is enough to end your employment prospects across the entire region. And blacklisting means returning to farms that couldn't support you in the first place, or trying to find domestic service work that pays even less, or potentially destitution if you've burned bridges with family and have nowhere else to go. The quirky historical detail that labour historians find significant. The Lowell Mill Girls couldn't form permanent unions because such organisations were illegal or heavily restricted for women in the 1840s. Instead, they organised through informal networks, boarding house connections, and temporary associations that formed around specific grievances. This made collective action harder to sustain, but also harder for companies to completely suppress, since there was no formal organisation to destroy, just networks of angry workers who might or might not maintain solidarity, depending on economic pressures and individual risk calculations. You stand there listening, calculating your own risk tolerance. 88 cents weekly is barely survivable, but 0 cents because you've been fired and blacklisted is definitely unsurvivable. Your family depends on the money you send home. Not a lot, but enough that losing it would mean your father might lose the farm entirely. Can you risk that for a turnout that historically has maybe a 20% chance of succeeding? On the other hand, can you accept a 15% wage cut without resistance? Knowing that demonstrates to the companies that workers will tolerate anything, ensuring future cuts and speed-ups until wages drop to whatever minimal level still keeps bodies showing up for shifts. Some workers are already leaving the meeting, too afraid of consequences to participate. Others are shouting agreement with Bagley, committing publicly to the turnout and daring the mills to retaliate. You're somewhere in the middle, sympathetic to the cause, understanding that collective action is necessary, but also paralysed by the very real fear of losing everything you've struggled to build over 2 years of industrial labour. The vote is called. Who will turn out tomorrow? Hands rise across the crowd. Not everyone, maybe 60% of those present, but enough to potentially make an impact if they all follow through. Your hand rises too, almost involuntarily, carried by the moment and the anger and the desperate hope that maybe this time will be different. Tomorrow, you'll face the choice. Walk past the mill gates with the other turnout participants, or break solidarity and save yourself. Tonight you've committed to resistance. Whether that commitment survives until morning remains uncertain. The morning of the turnout, you wake to the factory bell and immediately remember, today, you're supposed to refuse to answer it. Supposed to. That word carries a lot of weight when you're lying in a freezing boarding house room with 5 other girls who are all doing the same calculation. Solidarity versus survival. Collective action versus individual preservation. The revolutionary gesture versus the empty stomach. Sarah's already up, getting dressed in the darkness. Her movement's decisive. "I'm going in," she whispers. "I can't afford to lose this job. I'm sorry." You're not surprised. You're disappointed maybe, but not surprised, because the thing about collective action is that it requires everyone to collectively act, and the mills have deliberately structured employment to make that nearly impossible. By the time you reach the mill gates an hour later, the turnout has already collapsed. Maybe 30 workers stand outside in a cluster, Sarah Bagley among them, maintaining their protest while hundreds of others stream past them into the building. You pause at the gate, torn between joining the protest and joining the workers, knowing that the protest is doomed, but that crossing this line means accepting defeat. You cross, you go inside, you take your position at Loom 47 and begin another day of work under conditions that just got 15% worse. The turnout fails completely by noon. The 30 workers outside eventually disperse, some because they're hungry and scared, others because they recognise futility when it's this obvious. Within a week, Sarah Bagley and several other visible organisers are quietly fired and blacklisted. The wage cut proceeds as scheduled. Nothing changes except that now everyone knows exactly how powerless you are, which is possibly worse than the previous state of hoping that solidarity might matter. But let's talk about someone who has even less power than you do, because at least you're an adult making choices. Terrible choices with awful consequences, but choices nonetheless. The children working in this mill don't even have that much agency. They're here because their families need the money, or because they've been orphaned, or because the state of Massachusetts has a convenient system for dealing with dependent children that involves sending them to factories where their small hands and bodies can perform tasks that adults can't or won't. There's a boy named Tommy working your floor, can't be more than 8 years old, tiny and malnourished, employed as a doffer. His job is to run between the spinning frames, removing full bobbins and replacing them with empty ones, a task that requires speed, constant motion, and the ability to reach into moving machinery without getting caught. He works a 12-hour shift just like you do, earning maybe 50 cents a week that probably goes entirely to his family or to the boarding house where orphaned child workers are housed separately from adult women. You watch him dart between frames, his movements quick and practiced, occasionally stumbling from exhaustion but never stopping, because stopping means Mr. Morrison's attention, and children get disciplined more harshly than adult workers since they're assumed to need stricter correction. Tommy is small for his age, probably from malnutrition and the growth-stunting effects of industrial labour during critical developmental years. His hands show scars from machinery accidents. His posture is already developing the curved spine that comes from repetitive motion in awkward positions, and he has a chronic cough that sounds exactly like yours but worse because his lungs are smaller and less developed, and absorbing cotton dust with the same enthusiasm that yours do. Mainstream historical records confirm that child workers in textile mills experience stunted growth, higher injury rates, and respiratory problems at levels that even contemporary observers found troubling. Though troubling rarely translated into actual policy changes that might have protected children from industrial exploitation. The children work as doffers, sweepers, and general assistants, jobs that require small bodies and pay minimal wages. Doffers replace bobbins on spinning frames in the narrow spaces between machinery where adults can't easily reach. Sweepers crawl under looms to clear accumulated cotton waste and lint, spending their shifts literally beneath the machinery in spaces where getting caught would mean death or catastrophic injury. Some children work as battery fillers, carrying batteries of bobbins from one area to another, their small frames struggling under weights that would challenge adults. The work is dangerous, exhausting, and performed by people whose bodies haven't finished developing and whose education is effectively terminated by the demands of full-time labour. The legal framework around child labour in 1840s Massachusetts is what you might generously call relaxed. There are some regulations. Children under 12 aren't supposed to work more than 10 hours daily, and employers are required to provide schooling for child workers at least 3 months per year. These laws are enforced with the rigor you'd expect from regulations that inconvenience profitable businesses, sporadically, ineffectively, and with numerous loopholes that render them essentially meaningless. The mills claim to comply by running brief schools that consist of a tired worker spending an hour after shift teaching basic literacy to exhausted children who can barely stay awake. The 3-month requirement gets interpreted creatively. Maybe an hour a day counts as schooling, making 12 hours of factory work and 1 hour of barely functional education somehow compliant with child welfare laws. The quirky historical detail that social reformers found appalling. Some mills recruited children directly from poorhouses and orphanages, signing contracts with municipal authorities to take children off public assistance in exchange for providing them with employment opportunities and moral supervision. This created a pipeline from institutional poverty to industrial exploitation, with children essentially indentured to mills until they reached adulthood, their wages kept by the institutions that placed them, their working conditions subject to even less oversight than regular child workers received. You've seen children injured. Tommy himself has a mangled finger from getting it caught between bobbins 2 months ago, and there's a girl named Sarah, maybe 9 years old, who walks with a permanent limp from a sweeping accident where she was struck by a moving loom part. Dr. Thornton treated both injuries with his characteristic dismissiveness, and both children were back at work within days because healing is a luxury that poor families can't afford when children's wages mean the difference between survival and starvation. The normalization of child labour is the most disturbing aspect. Nobody questions it. Not the overseers who work these children 12 hours daily, not the parents who send them, not the doctors who treat their injuries, not the mill owners who profit from their labour. It's simply how the system works. Poor families need money, children can earn money, therefore children work in factories. The logic is brutal in its simplicity, and questioning it seems almost naive when you're operating in an economic system that considers child wages a family necessity rather than a moral atrocity. Historians still argue whether New England child labour practices were better or worse than those in English factories or southern cotton fields, which is a debate that feels academic when you're watching 8-year-old Tommy cough up cotton dust between bobbin changes. Maybe it's marginally better here. Maybe the comparative analysis matters for understanding industrial development patterns. But Tommy's still 8 years old, still working 12-hour shifts, still developing chronic health problems that will follow him for life, assuming he survives to adulthood. The bell rings for the midday break, and Tommy stumbles toward the stairs with the other child workers, moving slowly from exhaustion and injury. He'll have 45 minutes to eat whatever minimal food his boarding situation provides, and then he'll be back here, running between spinning frames, his childhood consumed by machinery that doesn't care about his age or his future, or the fact that he should be playing instead of working. You turn back to your loom, complicit through your presence, surviving through your labour, part of a system that chews up children and calls it economic necessity. The machinery roars, the children work, the profits accumulate, and everyone pretends this is normal. Saturday evening brings one of the genuine bright spots in your otherwise relentless routine. The Lyceum lecture at the town hall, open to all mill workers, featuring speakers on topics ranging from moral philosophy to natural science to literary criticism. Tonight's lecture is on the ancient civilizations of Egypt, delivered by a travelling scholar whose credentials are probably questionable, but whose enthusiasm is genuine enough to make 2 hours of Egyptian history feel like actual entertainment rather than obligation. You've finished your work shift, consumed Mrs. Chandler's Saturday dinner, slightly better than weekday fare featuring actual meat that you could identify as pork, and now you're walking through the cold evening, toward the hall with Mary and a few other boarding house girls, anticipating something that doesn't involve machinery or cotton dust, or the constant threat of wage deductions. The Lyceum system is one of the mill company's better ideas, genuinely providing cultural enrichment rather than just performing it for propaganda purposes. The lectures are free, open to all workers, and cover subjects that range from practical to purely intellectual. You've attended talks on astronomy, Shakespeare, moral reform, geology, political economy, and one memorable evening where a phrenologist examined volunteers' skulls to determine their character traits, which was probably pseudoscience but thoroughly entertaining. The companies sponsor these events partly from genuine belief that workers should have access to education, and partly because educated workers make better employees and also because having mill girls attend intellectual lectures makes excellent material for recruitment pamphlets about how factory work uplifts rather than degrades female labourers. The hall is already filling when you arrive, maybe 200 workers scattered across benches, most of them women but some male workers too, everyone dressed in their Saturday best clothing, which is still fairly shabby but at least clean. There's an atmosphere of anticipation, of people grateful for something to do besides collapse from exhaustion or stare at boarding house walls. The lecturer appears, Professor Whitman, or so he claims, a middle-aged man with wild hair and genuine passion for ancient Egypt that transcends whatever credentialing issues he might have. For 2 hours, you're transported. Professor Whitman describes pyramids and pharaohs, hieroglyphics and mummies, the Nile River, and its annual floods that sustained one of history's greatest civilizations. He has drawings he's made himself, passing them around the audience, showing architectural details and artistic motifs with the enthusiasm of someone who genuinely loves his subject. You sit there, tired and achy from the week's labour, but your mind is wandering along the Nile, imagining a world so different from this mill town that it might as well be fiction. Mainstream historical accounts emphasise that the Lyceum movement brought culture and education to working people across America, creating opportunities for intellectual development regardless of class background, which is absolutely true and one of the few aspects of Milltown life that actually lives up to its idealistic billing. The lecture ends with applause and you file out into the cold night feeling marginally more human than you did this morning. It's not much. 2 hours of Egyptian history doesn't change your wages or your working conditions or the cotton dust accumulating in your lungs, but it's something. A reminder that life contains possibilities beyond endless labour and exhaustion. Back at the boarding house, you have perhaps an hour before the 10 p.m. lockdown, and you spend it in the most illicit way possible, reading a novel. The book is David Copperfield by Charles Dickens, borrowed from another worker who somehow acquired it, despite Mrs. Chandler's disapproval of fiction, as potentially corrupting to young women's morals. You're reading by lamplight in your cramped bedroom, Sarah looking over your shoulder because you're both desperate for the story, while Harriet keeps watch for Mrs. Chandler's evening rounds. The novel is revelation. Dickens writing about poverty and exploitation, and the cruelty of social systems with the sharp clarity of someone who understands exactly what you're experiencing, even though he's writing about England and you're living in Massachusetts. The Lowell Mills actually have lending libraries. The companies maintain reading rooms where workers can access approved books and periodicals. The selection is carefully curated. Religious texts, moral improvement literature, educational materials, poetry that doesn't question social hierarchies, and novels that reinforce rather than challenge existing values. You've read some of these approved books, and they're fine, but they don't speak to your reality the way Dickens does with his unflinching portrayals of how industrial capitalism treats its workers. So you read smuggled novels, passing them hand to hand through boarding house networks, creating underground literary circles that Mrs. Chandler would absolutely disapprove of if she knew about them. The quirky cultural detail that literary historians love. Mill girls actually published their own periodical, called The Lowell Offering, featuring essays, poetry and stories written by factory workers during their limited free time. The publication was used by mill companies as evidence that industrial labour was compatible with feminine culture and intellectual development, and it genuinely did provide an outlet for worker creativity. It was also subject to editorial oversight that discouraged criticism of working conditions, creating a complicated relationship where worker voices were amplified but also constrained by the same power structures that controlled their labour. There's a letter from home waiting for you. Mrs. Chandler distributed mail after dinner, and you've been saving it for this quiet moment before bed. Your mother writes in her careful script about farm news, the cow that died, your younger brother's progress in school, your father's ongoing struggles with debt that your wages help address but never fully resolve. Her tone is affectionate but strained, and you can read between the lines the hope that you'll stay at the mill, keep sending money, continue sacrificing your youth and health for the family's survival. There's no pressure explicitly stated, but it saturates every sentence. The quiet expectation that daughters do their duty, that family obligation outweighs personal suffering, that your wages matter more than your well-being. You write back once a month, carefully crafting letters that emphasize the positive aspects of mill life, the lectures, the friendships, the cash wages. while minimizing the reality of cotton dust and wage cuts, and the grinding exhaustion that defines your existence. Your mother doesn't need to know about the cough or the failed turnout or how close you came to losing fingers to a rogue shuttle last Tuesday. She needs to believe that you're thriving, that the sacrifice is worthwhile, that sending her 17-year-old daughter to a factory was the right choice for the family's welfare. So you write cheerful lies, maintaining the fiction that everyone needs to believe to justify this arrangement. The small pleasures accumulate, Saturday lectures that expand your mind, smuggled novels that validate your experiences, letters from home that maintain connection to a life before the mills. There's also Sunday afternoon walks when weather permits, conversations with other workers who become genuine friends, the occasional bit of ribbon or candy purchased from your meagre wages as tiny luxuries that feel disproportionately significant. These moments don't compensate for the exploitation. Nothing could, but they make survival possible, creating tiny spaces of joy within a system designed to extract maximum labor from your body. Historians still argue whether the cultural amenities provided by Lowell Mills genuinely improved workers' lives or simply made exploitation more palatable, and honestly, you think both are true. The lectures are genuinely enriching and also excellent propaganda. The libraries provide real intellectual stimulation and also carefully control what ideas you're exposed to. The whole system offers just enough humanity to keep you functioning while extracting everything you have to give. Mrs. Chandler's footsteps sound in the hallway, evening rounds beginning. You quickly hide David Copperfield under your mattress, blow out the lamp and pretend to be settling in for sleep. The door opens, lamplight spills across the room, Mrs. Chandler's face appears briefly to confirm everyone's present and accounted for, and then she's gone, continuing her inspection. You lie in darkness, thinking about pyramids and novels and the letter you'll write tomorrow, treasuring these small escapes from the grinding routine. The bell will ring at 4:45 a.m., but for now, for these few precious hours, your mind is free, and that's almost enough. Sunday afternoon, after the mandatory morning church service and before the evening prayer requirement, provides a few hours of genuine free time when you can walk through the town and observe the broader ecosystem that's been constructed around textile manufacturing. You leave Mrs. Chandler's boarding house with Mary and a few other girls, ostensibly for a wholesome constitutional that will improve your health and moral character, but really just to get out of the cramped quarters and see something besides factory walls and boarding house ceilings. The walk takes you through the heart of Lowell, and what you see is a town that's been deliberately engineered to serve industrial capitalism with the efficiency of the machinery you tend daily. The most visible landmark is Mr. Pemberton's mansion, positioned on a hill overlooking the mill complex like a feudal lord's castle surveying his domain. It's a Greek revival monstrosity, white columns, perfectly proportioned windows, manicured grounds that require full-time gardeners to maintain. You've never been inside, obviously, but you've heard it has 12 rooms, imported furniture, a library with more books than the worker reading room, and servants who are paid better than you despite doing work that's objectively less dangerous than operating power looms. The architectural message is clear. The people who profit from your labour live in completely different material circumstances than the people performing the labour, and this disparity isn't accidental or unfortunate. It's the entire point of the system. Below the mansion, spreading down the hill toward the river, is the company town proper. Everything owned, operated or controlled by the mill corporations. There's the company store where you bought those overpriced stockings, the company bank where workers can deposit savings, assuming they have savings, which most don't. The company boarding houses arranged in neat rows, each housing 20 to 30 workers under the supervision of keepers who report to the mill agent. The company church where you're required to worship, the company meeting hall where approved lectures occur, the company reading room with its carefully curated book selection. It's a total environment, a closed system where almost every aspect of life connects back to the mills and their owners. Mainstream historical accounts emphasize that company towns provided workers with comprehensive amenities and services, creating communities rather than just employment sites. This is accurate. It's also true that these amenities came with control. The companies didn't provide housing and shops and churches out of pure benevolence, but because controlling workers' entire environment made them more dependent, more compliant, and less likely to organize effective resistance. You can't easily strike against an employer who also owns your housing, your food sources, and your access to community institutions. The town also contains businesses not directly owned by the mills, independent shops, a few boarding houses run by entrepreneurs rather than the company's taverns and saloons that cater primarily to male workers and exist in a kind of tolerated semi-legality. You pass one such establishment now, Murphy's Tavern, where you can hear male voices and occasional laughter filtering through the door. Saturday nights, the saloons fill with male mill workers and construction labourers spending their wages on alcohol, creating scenes that range from jovial to violent depending on how much gets consumed. The mill companies officially disapprove of drinking. It's incompatible with the image of moral industrial capitalism they're cultivating, but they also tolerate it because men need somewhere to go and something to do, and better they drink in established taverns than cause trouble elsewhere. The gender dynamics of Milltown life are starkly visible in these different social spaces. You and the other mill girls are subject to constant surveillance, strict curfews, mandatory church attendance, and behavioural codes that regulate everything from dress to reading material to social interactions. The male workers, by contrast, have relative freedom. They can drink, gamble, visit less respectable establishments, and generally behave like adults making their own choices. The justification is that women need protection and moral supervision while men are naturally capable of self-governance, which is ideology masquerading as natural law and conveniently serves to maintain control over female workers who might otherwise organise more effectively if they had the same freedoms as men. You pass the town green where the failed turnout meeting occurred, now empty and peaceful in the Sunday afternoon light. A few families are walking, children playing, the scene almost idyllic if you ignore the brick mill towers visible from every angle and the pervasive understanding that everything here exists to serve textile production. The quirky sociological detail that urban planners find fascinating. Lowell was designed as a planned industrial city with specific zones for manufacturing, worker housing, management residences and commercial activity. It represented an early American experiment in rational urban design, creating a template that other mill towns would copy. The rationality was purely from capital's perspective: efficient extraction of labour, maximum control of workers, optimal profit generation. But it created distinctive urban forms that historians still study as examples of industrial-age city planning. Beyond the immediate mill district, Lowell contains neighbourhoods where longer-term residents live, shopkeepers, professionals, skilled tradesmen who aren't directly employed by the mills but whose livelihoods depend on the industrial economy. These people occupy a middle ground between your poverty and Mr. Pemberton's wealth, and they regard mill workers with mixed attitudes, some sympathy for your conditions, some contempt for your supposed moral weakness, some fear that you represent a dangerous new class of industrial labourers who might disrupt the social order. You're economically necessary but socially suspect, your presence tolerated because the mills need workers, but your behaviour constantly scrutinised because respectable society worries that factory girls might be corrupted by independence and wage earning. There's a small park along the river, not company-owned, surprisingly, where you and Mary sit on a bench and watch the water flow past. The Merrimack River powers the mills through a complex canal system, its force diverted and channeled to turn the great water wheels that drive the machinery. The river is both natural feature and industrial infrastructure, its power harnessed with the same ruthless efficiency that harnesses your labour. Historians still argue whether water power-based industrialisation in New England created fundamentally different working conditions than steam-powered factories in England or coal-powered mills in Pennsylvania. But sitting here watching the same water that powers your looms, you're not sure the distinction matters much when the end result is still 13-hour shifts breathing cotton dust. The walk has taken you in a rough circle, and you're heading back toward the boarding house now, curfew approaching. You've seen the mansion and the company town and the independent businesses all coexisting in this strange industrial ecosystem. You've observed the class divisions made visible through architecture and geography. You've glimpsed the male workers' different experiences and the respectable citizens' ambivalent attitudes toward the mill girl phenomenon you represent. And what you've confirmed is something you already knew. You live in a system designed to extract maximum value from your labour while providing minimum support for your welfare. The whole town, from Mr. Pemberton's mansion to Mrs. Chandler's boarding house to the taverns where men drink, is structured around this fundamental dynamic. The bells will ring tomorrow at 4:45 a.m., the machinery will roar, the cloth will be produced, and the mansion on the hill will continue overlooking it all, beautiful and distant and utterly indifferent to your suffering. The evening bell rings at 6:45 p.m., releasing you from the looms after 13 hours of standing, watching, piecing broken threads, and slowly converting your youth into textile products that will be sold under brand names you'll never see to customers who'll never think about the hands that made them. The machinery shudders to a stop, and the sudden comparative silence hits your ears like physical pressure. That high-pitched ringing that's become your constant companion, the souvenir of industrial labour that you'll carry into whatever future awaits beyond these brick walls, assuming you have a future that extends beyond next week's identical routine. You don't run to the boarding house tonight. You can't. Your feet are swollen to the point where each step sends sharp pains radiating up your legs. Your back feels like someone's been using it as a woodworking surface, and your fingers are cramped into semi-permanent claw shapes from gripping machinery for most of your waking hours. You walk slowly with the other exhausted workers, a shuffling mass of humans who've given everything to the mills today and will be expected to give everything again tomorrow, and the day after that, and the day after that, until eventually something breaks. Your body, your spirit, or possibly both simultaneously, in a catastrophic failure that Dr. Thornton will diagnose as personal weakness rather than systemic exploitation. Mrs. Chandler has dinner waiting, Sunday's leftovers reheated into something that barely qualifies as food, but which your body needs because you burned roughly 3,000 calories today while consuming maybe 1,200. You eat mechanically, tasting nothing, your jaw working through motions while your mind drifts in that peculiar exhaustion fog where thinking becomes difficult and existing requires all your available energy. Around the table, 23 other girls are performing the same ritual of consumption. Everyone too tired for conversation. Everyone just trying to fuel their bodies enough to survive until the next break. You should wash. There's a basin in your room, cold water that would at least remove some of the day's accumulation of sweat and cotton dust and general industrial grime. But washing requires standing, requires arm movements, requires energy you don't have, so instead you climb the stairs to your bedroom with your skin still coated in the residue of factory labour, your dress still damp with perspiration, your hair still full of textile fibres that will probably work themselves into your pillow and contaminate your sleep the way they contaminate your waking hours. The bedroom is cold and dark and welcoming only in the sense that it contains a bed where you can finally stop standing. Sarah is already there, half undressed, too exhausted to care about modesty or proper nighttime routines. Harriet is crying quietly in the corner, her usual evening activity, and nobody comments because what's there to say? You're all equally miserable, all equally trapped, all equally aware that tomorrow will be identical to today, which was identical to yesterday, which will be identical to every day until something fundamental changes or you die, whichever comes first. You collapse onto the bed fully clothed, not even bothering to remove your dress or boots or the apron that's tied so tightly it's cutting into your waist. The bed is too small for 3 people, and Sarah's already occupying more than her fair share of space. But you wedge yourself in anyway because the alternative is standing, and you've done enough standing for one lifetime, let alone one day. Elizabeth hasn't arrived yet, probably using the privy or maybe having her own breakdown in some private corner. So for a few blessed moments you have marginally more space than usual. Your body catalogues its complaints, feet throbbing, back screaming, hands cramping, lungs burning with accumulated dust, a headache that's been building since mid-afternoon and now feels like someone's tightening a metal band around your skull. Every part of you hurts, in specific ways that you could describe in detail if you had the energy, but you don't. So instead you just lie there experiencing the totality of industrial damage and hoping that sleep comes quickly enough that you don't have to be conscious for too long in this state. The room gradually fills with the other girls, everyone preparing for sleep with varying degrees of effort. Catherine strips down to her shift. She's got more energy than most, probably because she's only been here 6 months and hasn't fully broken yet. Mary just removes her boots and collapses beside you on the other bed, her weight shifting the mattress and causing Sarah to grunt in annoyed half-sleep. Harriet continues crying softly, and someone, probably Catherine, tells her gently to be quiet, which is unkind but understandable when everyone's exhausted and crying doesn't help anything anyway. Mrs. Chandler makes her final rounds, checking that everyone's accounted for and reasonably settled. Her lamplight sweeps across the room briefly, illuminating 6 girls in various states of exhaustion and undress, before she moves on to check the next room. You hear her keys jingling as she locks the front door, 10 p.m. lockdown commencing, everyone secured for the night like inventory properly warehoused. The darkness is complete now, broken only by moonlight through the single window. You can hear breathing around you. Sarah's already snoring softly, Catherine shifting position, Harriet's crying, finally trailing off into hiccups and then silence. Your own breathing is shallow and raspy from the day's cotton dust accumulation, and you know you'll probably cough yourself awake at least once tonight. But for now, you're just grateful to be horizontal, grateful to not be standing, grateful for the few hours of unconsciousness before the bell rings again. 4:45 a.m. That's when it starts over. The bell, the rush to dress, the sprint to the mill, the machinery roaring to life, the 13 hours of standing and watching and breathing dust and dodging shuttles, and surviving moment by moment until the evening bell releases you to do it all again. Your eyes close. Your body begins the slow process of inadequate recovery that sleep provides. And somewhere in the darkness, the mill towers stand waiting, patient and hungry, ready to consume tomorrow's labour just as thoroughly as they consume today's. The breathing around you softens into the rhythms of sleep, each girl finding her own escape from the day's demands. The room grows quieter, warmer somehow, as if exhaustion itself creates a cocoon against the cold. Your muscles begin to unclench, slowly, releasing tensions they've held since before dawn. The pain doesn't disappear. It never fully does. But it fades to something manageable, something you can exist alongside rather than fight against. Outside, the mill town settles into its own kind of rest. The machinery stands silent in the darkness. The canals flow steadily, water moving whether workers sleep or wake. The mansion on the hill glows with lamplight from windows where people who've never tended looms spend their evening hours in comfort you can barely imagine. But that world feels distant now, separated from this small room by more than just physical space, separated by the fog of exhaustion that softens everything, even the anger and resentment that fuel your waking hours. You drift at the edge of sleep, that space where consciousness loosens its grip and the day's memories blur into something less sharp, less painful. The looms recede, the cotton dust settles. Even the knowledge that morning comes too soon loses its immediate terror, pushed away by the body's desperate need for rest. In this moment, this suspended space between waking and true sleep, you're just a tired girl in a crowded bed, breathing slowly, existing without effort. The struggles wait for tomorrow. The choices and compromises and daily survivals can be postponed for a few precious hours. Right now, there's only warmth and darkness, and the gentle pull of sleep drawing you deeper into its mercy. Your last conscious thought is something simple, something small. Tomorrow, if you survive it, will end too, and there will be another night, another bed, another chance to rest. The bell will ring, it always does. But not yet, not for a few more hours. For now, sleep comes, finally, blessedly, completely, and you let it take you home.